Victoria Sinclair had stood in boardrooms that made grown men flinch. She had negotiated contracts worth 9 figures without blinking. She had buried grief, ambition, and loneliness under a wardrobe that cost more than most people's cars. But nothing, not one single moment in her 30 years, had prepared her for the morning she walked into her father's office and discovered that the empire she had sacrificed everything to protect was already gone. Not failing. Gone. And the only man who could save it was someone she had never met. A mechanic, a widower, a stranger with a daughter and a small house, and grease permanently worked into the lines of his hands. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The call came on a Tuesday. Victoria remembered that detail with strange clarity afterward. The way the morning had started out ordinary, even pleasant, the kind of Tuesday that didn't announce itself as the hinge point of an entire life. She had been in the back of a car moving through downtown traffic, a cortado balanced in one hand and her phone in the other, scrolling through acquisition reports that her assistant had flagged for review. Outside the window, the city moved at its usual indifferent pace. She hadn't been paying particular attention to any of it. Then her father's name lit up the screen, and something shifted in her chest before she even answered. Harold Sinclair did not call during business hours. He sent emails. He had his assistant schedule formal meetings. He communicated through intermediaries and legal channels and carefully worded memos. The man had once delivered news of Victoria's mother's hospitalization through a typed note slid under her dormitory door at boarding school. A phone call at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning was not Harold Sinclair's style. She answered on the second ring. "Where are you?" His voice was flat. Not angry. Flat in a way that was worse than angry. "In the car. 10 minutes from the office." She set the cortado down. "What's wrong?" A pause. Long enough that she could hear the faint sound of traffic through his end of the line, which meant he was somewhere he shouldn't be. Outdoors, exposed, not behind the insulated walls of the Sinclair Group's 42nd floor. "Come to the house," he said. Not the office. The house. The call ended. Victoria stared at the screen for a moment, then told the driver to change direction. Well, the Sinclair family home sat on 4 acres in Westfield, behind a gate that required 3 separate authorization codes to open. Victoria had grown up inside those gates, had learned to walk on the marble floors of the entrance hall, had done her homework at the long mahogany table in the East Library while her father worked 18-hour days building an empire she was expected to inherit. She knew every room, every corner, every peculiar silence of that house. She had not been back in 7 months. Harold was waiting for her in his study, which was unusual. He was almost always behind the desk when she came to this room. He was standing at the window instead, his back to the door, looking out at the garden. He had aged in 7 months. That was Victoria's first thought, and she was not a person who thought sentimental things easily. But it was undeniable. The set of his shoulders was different, the weight of him. "Sit down," he said, without turning around. "I'm fine standing." He turned then, and she saw his face fully, and she understood that whatever this was, it was serious in a way she had not anticipated. "The Sinclair Group is insolvent," he said. The word landed strangely. It had a clinical sound, like a diagnosis. "What do you mean, insolvent?" "I mean exactly what the word means." He moved to his desk, but didn't sit either. He stood behind it with both hands flat on the surface, like a man steadying himself on a ship deck. 19 months of consecutive losses, a hedge position that went catastrophically wrong last spring. 3 commercial real estate investments that are underwater by roughly $240, and a credit line that 2 of our primary lending partners have decided, simultaneously, not to renew. Victoria said nothing. She was doing the math, and the math was telling her things she didn't want to hear. "We have approximately 60 days before we cannot meet payroll," Harold continued. 90 days before we are looking at formal insolvency proceedings. The legal team has been managing the optics, but the situation is... He stopped, picked up a pen from the desk, looked at it, put it back down. "There is no restructuring path that works on the timeline we have. There are always restructuring paths. Not when your primary creditors have already been contacted by Meridian Capital." The name hit her like a physical thing. Meridian Capital was run by a man named Douglas Hale, who had spent 11 years trying to dismantle the Sinclair Group through various means: regulatory challenges, hostile acquisition attempts, coordinated short positions against their publicly traded subsidiaries. He had failed every time. But 11 years was a long time, and Douglas Hale was not a man who ran out of patience. He approached them, Victoria said. He more than approached them. He's offering to assume the debt, all of it, in exchange for operational control of the group's 3 largest subsidiaries and the Sinclair family's equity stake. That's not an assumption of debt. That's a hostile takeover with extra steps. Yes. Then we fight it. With what? Harold's voice cracked slightly on the second word, and that small fracture, told her more than the financial figures had. Her father did not crack. We have 60 days and no capital and no partner willing to come in at the valuation we need. I have had conversations with 7 institutional investors in the past 3 weeks. All 7 have declined. Victoria stood very still. Outside the study windows, the garden was doing ordinary garden things. A bird moved across the grass. A cloud shifted overhead. Everything outside the room was continuing normally, which felt obscene. You said there's no restructuring path that works, she said finally. That implies there's a path that technically works, but that you haven't mentioned yet. Harold looked at her. She had her mother's eyes, people said, sharp and dark and reading everything. He had always found it slightly difficult to hold that gaze. Sit down, Victoria. Tell me what the path is. He pulled a folder from the top drawer of his desk and set it on the surface between them. She didn't reach for it yet. There is an individual, Harold said carefully, who has expressed interest in a debt absorption arrangement. Full assumption of the group's outstanding obligations, an infusion of operating capital sufficient to stabilize the business, and a structured buyback option that would allow the family to recover equity within 5 years. Who? His name is Ethan Brooks. I don't know that name. No, you wouldn't. She reached for the folder. It was thin. A few pages, a photograph clipped to the inside front cover. She opened it and looked at the photograph and felt a confusing mix of things she couldn't immediately sort. The man in the photograph was in his early 30s, dark hair that needed cutting, a face that had some mileage in it, not old, not worn, but lived in, the way certain faces got when they'd been through something. He was standing in front of what appeared to be an auto repair garage. He was wearing a gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He was not looking at the camera. He appeared to have been caught mid-conversation with someone off-frame, and whoever had taken the photograph had caught him in an unguarded moment, half smiling at whatever the off-frame person had said. It was not the photograph of a financial titan. He owns a garage, Victoria said. He owns a garage, yes. You want me to believe that a man who owns a garage is offering to absorb the Sinclair Group's debt. I want you to review the terms on page 3. She turned to page 3. Read it once, then read it again, more slowly. The terms were real. The capital figures were real. The debt absorption structure was precisely engineered, not the work of someone who had called a lawyer 2 weeks ago, but the product of sustained and sophisticated financial thinking. Whoever had drafted this document understood the Sinclair Group's liability architecture in granular detail. This is a marriage proposal, she said. She heard her own voice and noted, distantly, that it was very calm. It is a conditional debt arrangement that requires me to marry him. That's a marriage proposal, Father. Harold said nothing. He's requiring marriage as a condition of the deal. He has a daughter, Harold said, as if that explained something. He lost his wife 4 years ago. He has a 6-year-old daughter, and He stopped again, and this time the pause was different, heavier. He wants stability. He wants a structured arrangement with someone who understands the kind of world he's operating in. What kind of world is he operating in? He's a mechanic. He is more than he appears. I have reason to believe that, although I cannot give you a full account of why I believe it. You cannot give me a full account. Victoria closed the folder. You are asking me to marry a stranger whose background you have not fully investigated, who owns a garage and has a small child, who has somehow materialized with the exact capital required to save our company, and whose full identity you cannot explain to me. I'm asking you to consider I understand what you're asking. She set the folder back on the desk, pushed it toward him with 2 fingers. I need 24 hours. She didn't sleep that night. This was not unusual. Victoria Sinclair had not been a good sleeper since her early 20s. There was too much to think about, and her brain did not observe office hours. But this particular sleeplessness was different. She lay in her apartment on the 31st floor of a building she partly owned, staring at the ceiling, and tried to think her way through what her father had told her with the same analytical rigor she brought to every professional problem. She made lists, she ran scenarios, she identified variables and assigned probabilities. At 3 in the morning, she got up and made tea, she didn't drink, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking at the city spread out below her. The city was enormous and glittering and full of people who did not know that the Sinclair Group was 60 days from collapse. She had spent most of her adult life being the kind of person who stood at windows like this one, looking down at things. It occurred to her, standing there in the dark with cold tea getting colder on the counter behind her, that she had no idea when exactly she had stopped thinking of that as a privilege and started thinking of it as simply where she lived. She called her father at 6:15. "I have conditions," she said when he picked up. "Tell me." "I want a private meeting with Brooks before I sign anything. Alone, no lawyers, no intermediaries." "I'll arrange it." "And I want a full financial disclosure package. Not his, ours. I want to know exactly what we're bringing into this arrangement. I'm not walking into a negotiation blind." "Of course. And if this falls apart, if there is any indication that this man is not what you believe him to be, I walk away and we find another path. Whatever that path is. There isn't another—" "Those are my conditions, Father." A long pause. "I'll arrange the meeting for this week." She hung up and stood in her kitchen for a while, listening to the city wake up outside her windows. The meeting was arranged for Thursday. Victoria spent the 2 intervening days doing what she always did when she was unsettled by something. She worked. She reviewed the Sinclair Group's full liability structure with the CFO, a quiet man named Gerald, who had been with the company for 19 years and whose face told her everything she needed to know about how bad things actually were. She had 3 separate calls with the legal team. She reviewed the terms of the debt arrangement again and had her own attorney assess them, who came back with the same assessment she'd already formed. The terms were fair to the point of being almost generous, which raised its own set of questions. She also, in a moment she preferred not to examine too closely, looked up Ethan Brooks online. There was less than she expected. A business registration for Brooks Automotive, established 8 years ago. A residential address in a neighborhood called Clairton, which she had to look up on a map because she'd never heard of it. A brief mention in a local community newsletter about a youth baseball fundraiser. A 3-year-old obituary for a woman named Claire Brooks, survived by her husband Ethan and their daughter Ava, who had died after a 2-year illness at the age of 29. Victoria read the obituary twice. It was short, 5 sentences. It named Claire's parents and a sister and described her as beloved by everyone who knew her, which was the kind of thing people wrote when they didn't know what else to say. She closed the browser and went back to the liability spreadsheets. The meeting took place at a coffee shop, which was itself a kind of statement. Her father had offered the group's conference rooms. Ethan Brooks had suggested a coffee shop on the corner of 2 streets in the financial district that Victoria had passed hundreds of times without ever entering. She arrived 7 minutes early because she always arrived early to negotiations. The place was medium-sized, moderately busy, with the kind of lived-in character that came from being in the same location for a long time. She found a table in the corner with sight lines to both the entrance and the counter, ordered black coffee she didn't particularly want, and waited. He was on time. She recognized him immediately from the photograph, which was interesting because the photograph had not been a particularly flattering or revealing image. He was taller than she'd estimated from the picture, easily over 6 feet, and he moved through the coffee shop with the kind of unhurried attention that she associated with people who were comfortable in their own bodies and didn't particularly care who was watching. He spotted her before she could do the thing she'd planned, which was to observe him for a moment before being noticed. He came directly to the table. "Ms. Sinclair." His voice was lower than she'd expected. He pulled out the chair across from her without being invited and sat down, dropping a worn canvas jacket over the back of it. He was not wearing a suit. He was wearing dark jeans and a blue button-down with the top button open, and he looked like someone who had considered the occasion and dressed appropriately for it without making a performance out of it. "Mr. Brooks?" She extended her hand. He shook it. His hand was rough in places, not the soft handshake of boardroom people, but the grip was sure and brief, and he let go without holding. A server came. He ordered coffee, plain, and thanked the server by name, which meant he'd been here before. "You've had 2 days to review the terms," he said when the server left. Not a preamble, not small talk, straight to it. "I have. And?" "The terms are favorable, almost suspiciously so." She watched his face when she said suspiciously. Something moved across it. Not offense, not concern, something that might have been faint amusement, which raises the question of what you're actually getting out of this arrangement. "I told you what I'm getting. You told my father. I want to hear it directly." He looked at her steadily for a moment. He had gray eyes, she noticed. Not cold gray, more the kind of gray that suggested they changed color in different light. "I have a daughter. She's 6. She's going to grow up asking questions about why her house only had one parent in it, and I don't have a good answer to that question. So you decided to buy a wife." His jaw tightened slightly. "I decided to build something structured, something real, but defined. I'm not looking for a performance. I'm not interested in someone who's going to move in and spend 6 months trying to get back out." "Then what are you interested in?" "Someone who shows up, who's present, who treats my daughter with basic human decency." He paused. "Someone who can function in the arrangement without treating it like a hostage situation. And you selected me for this. I selected you because you have a reason to be invested in making it work. And because—" He stopped, and for the first time she had the impression he was choosing his words with some care. "Because I read the piece in the Financial Review about the Meridian Capital dispute 3 years ago. The one where you found the regulatory filing that broke their acquisition attempt. You did that yourself, not your legal team. You." Victoria blinked. She had not expected that. "You read a 3-year-old regulatory filing story." "I read a lot." He picked up his coffee. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking you to pretend anything. I'm asking you to come into my house, treat my daughter like she matters, and give this a real attempt. In exchange, your family's company doesn't collapse." The directness of it was almost jarring. She had sat across from some of the most sophisticated negotiators in American business, and not one of them had ever opened with anything this blunt. "You understand what you're asking," she said. "You understand that my entire life is built around a different kind of existence." "I know what your life looks like." "Do you?" "I know you live in a building you partly own on the 31st floor. I know you haven't taken a vacation in 4 years. I know you were supposed to make partner at Westfield Consulting before your father asked you to come back to the group, and you gave that up, and you've spent the last 6 years trying to prove that was the right call." He set down his coffee. "I did my reading too." She held his gaze. "Then you know I'm not someone who adapts easily." "I'm not asking for easy. I'm asking for honest." She sat with that for a moment. Outside the coffee shop windows, the financial district was doing what it always did. Moving fast, talking loud, everyone performing their version of importance. She had belonged to that world so completely, for so long, that she had stopped being able to see it clearly. Looking out at it now, from inside this ordinary coffee shop, sitting across from a man who owned a garage and had memorized a 3-year-old magazine profile of her, she felt something she couldn't name pressing at the edges of the clean, controlled version of herself that she always brought to negotiations. 3 months, she said. "What?" "Give me 3 months. If the arrangement isn't functional, if it isn't working in ways that are clear to both of us, we renegotiate the structure." He considered this. Define functional. "Ava is well. You and I are managing the arrangement without active conflict. The company is stabilizing." She paused. "Those 3 things." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him think, really think, not perform thinking, and found herself noting, against her will, that it was not unpleasant to watch. 3 months, he said finally. "Yeah, okay." They shook hands across the coffee shop table, and it was the strangest deal she had ever made. and she drove home in a car she suddenly noticed was immaculate and climate-controlled and utterly silent, and sat in the parking garage of her building for 7 minutes before she went inside. 3 days. That was how long it took for the attorneys to prepare the formal documents, for the financial transfers to be initiated, for the logistical machinery of the agreement to begin moving. 3 days? And then Victoria Sinclair was standing on the sidewalk in front of a house in Clairton with 2 suitcases and a carry-on and a feeling in her chest that she could not accurately name. The house was small. That was the first thing. She had known it would be small. She had seen the address, had looked at the neighborhood on a map, had understood intellectually that this would not be a penthouse or a brownstone or anything in the range of what she was used to. But knowing and seeing were different things, and standing on the sidewalk with her suitcases, she registered the house with her whole body in a way that reading about it had not prepared her for. It was a 2-story Cape Cod style with pale blue paint that was fading in places. A small front porch with 2 chairs on it. A driveway with a truck parked in it that had some kind of sticker on the rear window she was too far away to read. A front yard that was neat but not manicured. The grass was cut, the borders were edged, but there were no landscaping flourishes, no statement plantings. It was a house where someone had done the necessary things but hadn't had the time or the resources or the inclination to do more than that. She was standing there still looking at it when the front door opened. Not Ethan. A child. Small, brown-haired, 6 years old, wearing a purple t-shirt with what appeared to be a dinosaur on it. She stood in the doorway and looked at Victoria with the unfiltered directness that small children brought to everything, head tilted slightly, taking in the suitcases, the clothes, the fact of a stranger standing on her front walk. Then she called back into the house, at a volume well out of proportion to her size. "Dad! She's here! She has a lot of bags!" Victoria stood on the sidewalk and felt, for the first time in a very long while, completely at a loss. Ethan appeared behind his daughter a moment later, hand resting briefly on her shoulder. He was in a gray work shirt, the same brand as in the photograph she noticed, which meant he owned more than one. And he had clearly come from the garage because there was a streak of something dark along the inside of his forearm that he'd made some effort to wash off, but hadn't entirely succeeded. "Ava, let her come up the steps." "I'm not in the way," Ava said, with the perfect certainty of a child who had never once believed she was in the way. "You're in the doorway." "The doorway isn't the steps." He gave Victoria a look over the top of his daughter's head that was very briefly, very specifically, an apology. Victoria picked up her suitcases and walked up the front path. "Victoria Sinclair," Ava said as she reached the porch steps. Not a question, a fact being confirmed. "Dad said you're going to live here." "Yes," Victoria said. "That's right. Are you going to sleep in the big bedroom?" "Ava," Ethan started, "because the big bedroom has the window that faces the maple tree. I like that window. But Dad said I can't sleep in there because it's his room, and now your room." She considered Victoria with her head still tilted, apparently working through something. "Do you like maple trees?" Victoria looked at the child. She was trying to remember the last time someone had looked at her with this much open, uncomplicated curiosity, and she could not think of an example. "I don't have a strong opinion about maple trees," she said. Ava appeared to take this as an acceptable answer. "That's okay. You'll probably get one." She stepped back from the doorway to let Victoria inside. The interior of the house was, she searched for the right word, and landed, somewhat reluctantly, on warm. Not warm in a designed way. Warm in the way that a place got when someone had been living in it with intention and without self-consciousness. There were books on a shelf that had clearly been read, a pair of small sneakers abandoned near the base of the stairs, a drawing tacked to the side of the refrigerator that she could see through the doorway into the kitchen, a house in crayon, badly proportioned, with a sun in the corner that had a smile on it. Everything in the place was fine and ordinary, and completely unlike anything she had lived in for the last 12 years. "Kitchen's through there," Ethan said. "Bathroom on the right, end of the hall. Your room is up the stairs, second door." He looked at her suitcases. "I'll get those." "I can manage." He was already picking them up. She noted as he did it that both cases were heavy enough that most people would have had to maneuver them upstairs with some effort, and he carried them like they were inconvenient rather than difficult. She followed him up the stairs without saying anything. The room was the largest bedroom, as Ava had indicated. It had white walls and a window that did, in fact, face a maple tree. The furniture was simple: a double bed with a plain dark wood frame, a dresser, a small nightstand with a lamp. Clean, uncluttered, a closet with good light. It was nothing like her bedroom on the 31st floor. It was nothing like anything she had slept in since she was a teenager. Ethan set the suitcases down near the closet. Ava's room is across the hall. She sleeps through the night pretty reliably, but she gets up early. Bathroom between the rooms. Why, you'll want to lock it from your side if you need privacy. Right. There's food in the kitchen. I usually cook, but if you... He stopped. Actually, let's not try to solve everything tonight. You just got here. Victoria looked at him. I appreciate the management, but I don't need to be handled. He looked back at her. I wasn't handling you. I was saying we don't need to set every rule tonight. A beat. There's a difference. She said nothing. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. For what it's worth, I know what this is. I'm not pretending it's something else. He looked at her steadily. But I meant what I said at the coffee shop. I'm asking for honest. Not easy, just honest. He left her alone in the room. Victoria stood in the middle of the floor of a small bedroom in a house she had never seen before, in a neighborhood she had never visited, in a life that had, in the space of 3 days, become completely unrecognizable. Outside the window, the maple tree moved slightly in the wind. One of the branches was close enough to the glass that it made a faint sound against it. Not loud, barely audible, just present. She sat down on the edge of the bed, pressed her palms flat against her thighs the way she did when she needed her hands to stop moving, looked at the ceiling. 60 days ago, she had been reviewing acquisition reports in the back of a car. Show up, he had said. Be present. She sat there in the quiet for a long time. Downstairs, she could hear the muffled sound of Ava's voice. Not the words, just the general brightness of the tone, the particular noise a child made when they were telling someone something important. And then Ethan's voice, lower, answering something, and a brief laugh. Not performed, just happening, a laugh that didn't know it was being listened to. Victoria looked at the window. The maple tree moved again. She stood up and began unpacking her suitcases. The first morning was the hardest. Victoria woke at 5:40, which was her normal time, in a room that was entirely wrong, not in the sense of being unpleasant, but in the sense of being unfamiliar in ways that her body registered before her mind fully caught up. The ceiling was lower than the one she was used to. The light coming through the maple tree window was different, filtered through leaves rather than bouncing off glass towers. The mattress was softer than hers. The sound profile of the house was completely foreign. No ambient building noise, no elevator machinery, no distant traffic from 31 floors down. Just a faint creak that old houses made when they shifted in the early morning, and somewhere outside birds. She lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, doing the thing she'd trained herself not to do, which was take stock of everything wrong with the situation before she'd given it any real time to develop. It was a habit her therapist, a woman she'd stopped seeing 2 years ago when her schedule made it genuinely impossible, had identified as Victoria's primary method of self-protection. Name the problem before the problem can surprise you. Stay ahead of it. Stay in control of the narrative. She got up before she could continue down that particular road. The bathroom was down the short hall, shared with Ava's room across the way, and she had learned on her first night that the lock was a simple push-button mechanism that required some force to engage properly. She showered quickly and dressed in the narrow bathroom with the particular efficiency of someone used to managing in small spaces during travel, then went downstairs. The kitchen was empty. This surprised her slightly. She wasn't sure what she had expected, some version of household activity. Instead, the kitchen was quiet, and the house was quiet. And it was just past 6 in the morning, and apparently she was the first one awake. She found the coffee and the machine and the filters in a reasonable amount of time, which felt like a minor accomplishment, and stood at the counter while it brewed and looked at the kitchen properly for the first time. It was practical. Everything in it had clearly been chosen because it worked, not because it looked good, not because it represented anything. The appliances were not new, but they were clean. There were dishes visible on an open shelf because there wasn't quite enough cabinet space to hide them all. And the dishes didn't match, and someone had organized them by size rather than by set, which meant the organizing had been done by a practical person rather than an aesthetic one. There was a magnetic strip on the wall beside the stove with knives on it, which told her Ethan actually cooked rather than just owning knives. There was a child's drawing on the side of the refrigerator. She'd noticed it the night before. And a second one she hadn't seen, half hidden behind a takeout menu. A figure with brown hair and an enormous smile, and the word AVA written underneath it in large, uneven letters, the way a child wrote their own name before they'd fully mastered the scale. Victoria poured coffee and took it to the small table by the window. Outside, the backyard was a modest rectangle of grass with a wooden fence and a large oak tree in the corner that had a rope hanging from it. Not a swing, just a rope, the kind a kid could climb or spin on. A basketball hoop stood at the far end of the yard, slightly tilted. Someone had attempted to straighten it and not quite succeeded. She sat with her coffee and the quiet and tried to locate the feeling she was having, which was not the sharp, identifiable feeling she was accustomed to, anxiety, determination, calculated readiness, but something softer and more difficult. Displacement, perhaps. The sensation of being a person who had been lifted from one context and set down in another before the air temperature had adjusted. She heard Ethan on the stairs before she saw him. His step was not heavy, but it was deliberate, the footfall of someone who had gotten up early enough times that they moved with purpose rather than grogginess, even at this hour. He came into the kitchen in jeans and a plain white t-shirt and socks, stopped briefly when he saw her at the table, and then continued to the coffee machine without making a thing of it. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early." "Me too." He poured a mug, leaned against the counter. "Ava's usually up by 7. She'll come downstairs and want to tell you what she dreamed about." "Is that a warning?" He looked at her. Something in his expression suggested he found this mildly funny, but wasn't going to perform it. "It's information. You can respond however you want." Victoria turned her mug in her hands. "Does she have a routine, school?" "School starts at 8:15. She needs to leave by 7:50. Earlier if I'm dropping her." He moved to the refrigerator and started pulling things out with the practiced automaticity of someone who had done this same morning assembly many times. "I'm at the garage by 7, most days. Roberta next door does afternoon pickup on days I can't get there. Retired, she doesn't mind. On days I'm back by 4, I get her myself." "Roberta," Victoria repeated. "She'll want to meet you. She already knows you're here. Ava told her yesterday." "Ava told her." "Ava tells her everything." He said it without any particular tone, just fact. He had eggs out now and something green from the crisper drawer. "Do you eat breakfast?" The question caught her slightly off guard, not because it was complicated, but because it was so straightforward. Not "what do you want?" Not "allow me to arrange something," just "do you eat breakfast?" the way you'd ask anyone. "Usually something light. I can manage my own. I'm already cooking. It's not a production." He looked at her briefly over his shoulder. "Yes or no?" "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and turned back to the stove, and they existed in the kitchen together in silence that was not entirely comfortable but was not actively bad either, and Victoria sat at the table by the window with her coffee and watched the backyard lighten as the sun came up properly behind the oak tree. Ava came downstairs at 6:58. Victoria knew the time because she had been checking it with the frequency of someone waiting for something to happen, which was a habit she recognized and did not particularly like about herself. She had finished her breakfast, eggs with something Ethan had identified as dill, which she hadn't expected to enjoy and did, and Ethan had left for the garage at 6:45 with a brief and entirely businesslike goodbye, and Victoria had been sitting at the kitchen table with a second coffee and her phone, reviewing overnight emails from the group's legal team, when she heard the irregular footsteps of a small person on stairs. Ava appeared in the kitchen doorway in pajamas that had a pattern of small yellow ducks on them, her brown hair in the specific chaos that children's hair achieved through sleeping, carrying a stuffed bear by one arm with the casual disregard of someone for whom this object was so permanent it no longer required attention. She stopped when she saw Victoria, not alarmed, just recalibrating. "You're still here," she said. "Yes," Victoria said. "I thought maybe you left." "No." Ava considered this. She came the rest of the way into the kitchen and went to the cabinet where, apparently, she knew where the cereal was, and got herself a bowl with the focused efficiency of a child who had done this particular task many times. She was not quite tall enough to reach the cereal on the second shelf without going on her toes, and she went on her toes with absolute seriousness and got it without asking for help. "Dad already went to work," she said, setting the bowl on the table across from Victoria. "I know, he told me. He goes early." She got milk from the refrigerator, poured it with great concentration, the kind of concentration that came from having spilled it before. "He comes back for dinner, though. He always comes back for dinner." Victoria looked at the child. The way she said always, not as a boast, just as a settled fact, something that had been proven to her enough times that it sat in her chest like a piece of furniture rather than a hope. He always comes back for dinner. It was the most important thing in her world, Victoria understood, and it was entirely ordinary. "What did you dream about?" Victoria heard herself ask. Ava looked up from her cereal with sudden full attention, like a light switching on. "You want to know?" "You dreamed something. Your father said you usually talk about it." "I dreamed about a horse," Ava said, with the authority of someone presenting important findings. "A purple one. It could fly, but it didn't want to because flying was scary, so it just walked everywhere and it was very slow." She ate a spoonful of cereal. "I think that's kind of sad." "Why?" "Because it could fly, but it didn't. That seems like a waste." Victoria looked at her. "Maybe the horse just didn't feel safe flying yet." Ava appeared to think about this with genuine care. "That's a good point," she said finally, in a tone of concession that somehow made Victoria want to smile. She didn't. They ate, or rather, Ava ate, and Victoria finished her coffee, in a silence that was easier than the one she'd shared with Ethan, because children did not load silence with adult weight. Ava ate her cereal and occasionally hummed something tuneless and looked out the window at the yard with the unfocused contentment of a person who did not feel any pressure to fill time meaningfully. Victoria, for the first time in recent memory, did not check her phone. What? She checked it as soon as she was back in her room. 23 emails from the legal team, 7 from Gerald, 2 from her father. She read through them with her back against the headboard, feet on the pale bedspread, and felt herself slide back into the identity that made sense to her, the one with a job and a strategy and clear adversaries and defined goals. The emails told a familiar story. Meridian Capital's attorneys had filed preliminary paperwork that suggested they were still pursuing their acquisition play despite the debt arrangement with Ethan. Whether they knew about the arrangement yet or were simply continuing a motion they'd started before it was finalized was unclear. Either way, it required immediate attention. She called Gerald. "How exposed are we?" she asked, without preamble. "The debt transfer was completed yesterday," he said. "That removes the primary mechanism Meridian had, but they've started approaching shareholders directly, the smaller institutional holders. Whispering campaign, suggesting the debt arrangement is a stopgap, that the underlying business fundamentals are still negative, that whoever holds equity in the group is going to see it erode further regardless." "Which shareholders?" He named 4. She knew all 4. None of them were rock-solid loyalists, but none of them had been on her radar as targets either. Hale was reading the room correctly, which was irritating. "Reach out to all 4 this week. I'll take 2, you take 2. Do it personally, not through attorneys, and get me the full list of institutional holders below 10%. I want to know who else is in play." "Victoria." Gerald paused. "Where are you? Your assistant said you were—" "I relocated temporarily. It doesn't affect anything. I have a phone and a laptop and I'm fully operational." "Right." She could hear him processing this without asking questions, which was one of the things she valued about Gerald. "I'll have the shareholder list to you by this afternoon." She hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in her lap. Through the walls, she could hear Ava singing something. Not words, just the melody of something, moving through the house with it, the way children moved through houses with things they were happy about. Victoria sat on the bed in the small white room and listened to it without quite meaning to. The first week was a calibration. That was how Victoria filed it in the part of her mind that cataloged things. She established a routine quickly, because routine was how she managed uncertainty. Wake at 5:40, coffee, review emails, be available and functional when Ava came downstairs. work in a room through the morning, eat whatever lunch was accessible or manageable, continue working, be present when Ava returned from school. The being present part was the part she hadn't mapped out properly, because she hadn't known what it would require. What it required, she discovered, was different from what she'd expected. Ava did not demand anything specific from her. She didn't ask Victoria to play or to engage or to perform any particular role. She simply seemed to operate on the assumption that Victoria was there, which meant she talked near her, included her in observations, occasionally asked her opinion on things of great importance, whether dinosaurs or dragons were more interesting, whether it was better to have a best friend or many friends, whether the word umbrella was a funny word or just a normal one. Victoria answered these questions honestly and without condescension, which appeared to be all that Ava required. No warmth was demanded, no performance, just honest engagement with whatever Ava brought. It should have been easy. It was not easy. It required a kind of lateral thinking Victoria had not regularly used, not the strategic, analytical engagement of her professional life, but something slower and more receptive, something that required her to actually stop and think about whether umbrella was a funny word before answering. It turned out, when she gave it real consideration, that it probably was. Ava laughed when she agreed. An uncomplicated, whole-body laugh. I knew it. Dad says it's just a normal word, but I think he's wrong. He might be, Victoria said. You could be right. You're on my side, Ava said with deep satisfaction, and went back to whatever she'd been drawing. Victoria sat with the warmth of that, the simple, unearned warmth of a child deciding you were on their side, and filed that too, in a different place than the calibration log, in a place she didn't examine too directly. Ethan came home for dinner every night. Not just most nights, every single night of that first week, exactly as Ava had described. Sometimes it was late, 6:45 or past it, and he'd come in with engine grease still somewhere on him and the specific tiredness that came from physical work rather than mental work, and he'd go straight to the kitchen and start making dinner because that was the routine, and the routine did not flex. Victoria watched him cook more than she intended to. Not for romantic reasons, or at least she told herself not for romantic reasons, and she believed it because she had enough self-awareness to know what romantic interest felt like, and this was something different. It was more that she found the watching instructive in a way she hadn't expected. Ethan cooked the way he did everything she'd observed, with full attention and without performance. He didn't do elaborate things. He didn't use it as an opportunity to demonstrate anything. He just made food that was actual food, using ingredients he appeared to keep reliably stocked, and the result was consistently better than the simplicity of the process suggested it should be. You cook every night, she said on Thursday, because by Thursday she had been watching long enough to have a genuine question about it. He glanced over his shoulder. He was making something with chicken and tomatoes that smelled better than anything her personal chef in the old apartment had produced in months. Yeah. By choice? Ava has opinions about food, strong ones. She needs to know what's in it. He stirred something. She went through a phase 2 years ago where she was convinced everything tasted better if I made it. I'm not sure that's true anymore, but the habit stuck. What kind of opinions? She won't eat anything orange, not because of the taste. She just doesn't like the color orange. Victoria processed this. Anything orange. Carrots, sweet potatoes, certain squashes. We work around it. He said it without complaint, without the martyred edge that some parents performed when describing their children's inconvenient preferences. Just a fact. Same as the cabinet organization or the tilted basketball hoop. Victoria set down the glass of water she'd been holding. That seems like a significant culinary limitation. It is. A beat. She'll grow out of it. Or she won't. And she'll just avoid orange food for the rest of her life. Either way, she'll be fine. It was such a completely grounded response that Victoria found herself without anything to say to it, which was unusual. She stood in the kitchen for another moment, and then she said, "Can I help with anything?" He looked at her, and she could see him reassessing something, though she couldn't tell what exactly. You cook? Not habitually, but I can follow a direction. He handed her a knife and gestured at a cutting board where there was a pile of herbs. Rough chop. Size doesn't matter much. She chopped herbs. He cooked. Ava came into the kitchen at some point and immediately stationed herself at Ethan's elbow to monitor proceedings, as was apparently her custom, offering commentary on the smell and the color and whether she thought it needed more salt, which Ethan responded to with the particular half-attention of a parent who had learned to process most of a child's stream of consciousness while still focusing on the actual task. Dinner was the three of them at the small kitchen table, and it was not graceful or performed or in any way the kind of meal Victoria associated with the word dinner, which in her life had meant either formal business occasions or carefully plated food in good restaurants, or the particular loneliness of eating alone in her apartment at 10 at night because she'd worked until 9:30 and ordered something and eaten it over her laptop. This was just food, at a table, with a child talking about her day in the fully committed way Ava brought to everything, and Ethan listening and asking one or two questions that showed he'd actually been listening, and Victoria sitting in the corner chair that had become hers by default, eating chicken and tomatoes and saying very little. It was not unpleasant. That was the thing she kept coming back to, given everything, given the circumstance, the strangeness, the distance from everything she knew. It was not unpleasant in ways she couldn't entirely explain. On Friday evening, Ethan's neighbor Roberta materialized. Victoria had been warned this would happen, but had not adequately prepared for the specifics, which were that Roberta was 67 years old, originally from New Orleans, with a direct conversational style that didn't leave much room for deflection. And she arrived with a covered dish and absolute certainty that she was welcome, which she evidently was, because Ethan opened the door before she knocked. "Roberta," he said, with the tone of someone who was not surprised. "I made jambalaya." She came in, set the dish on the counter, turned around, and looked at Victoria with the frank assessment of someone who had decided she was allowed to do this. "You're the wife." "Victoria Sinclair," Victoria said. "I know who you are. Ava told me things." Roberta's expression was not hostile, but it was not soft either. It was the expression of a woman who had watched this family from next door for some years and had opinions about what was good for them. "She tells me most things. You drink coffee in the morning by the window." "I do." "She watches you from the backyard. She thinks you look like you're thinking about something complicated." Victoria glanced briefly at Ethan, who had the look of a man who had decided not to interfere with this. "I usually am," Victoria said. Roberta appeared to consider this as a reasonable answer. "How are you finding things?" "Different from what I'm used to." "Different bad or different interesting?" Victoria held the older woman's gaze. "I'll let you know when I've had more time to assess." Something shifted in Roberta's expression, not approval exactly, but the slight adjustment of someone who had expected a softer or more evasive answer. "Fair enough." She turned to Ethan. "Jambalaya needs 20 minutes to heat. I'm not staying." "You can stay," he said. "I know I can. I'm choosing not to." She patted his arm with the familiarity of someone who had earned it. "You have enough people in the house right now." She left, and the kitchen felt briefly larger in her wake, and Ava appeared from the living room where she had apparently been listening to the entire exchange, saying, "Roberta likes you. She doesn't say fair enough to people she doesn't like." "How do you know what she says to people she doesn't like?" Ethan said. "I've heard her," Ava said, with perfect reasonableness. The second week was harder in a different way. The first week had been about logistics, learning the physical arrangement of the house, the rhythms of the household, the social geography of Ava and Ethan and Roberta, and the school morning and the dinner hour. The second week, the logistics were largely known, which left more space for everything else. What she noticed in the second week was the quality of Ethan's tiredness. He worked long hours. She'd known that, but knowing it and watching it were different. He was at the garage by 7, sometimes earlier. He came home by 6:30 most nights. On Tuesday, he came home at 8 because a transmission job had run long, and when he came in, he was so tired that he sat down at the kitchen table instead of going straight to the stove. And Ava, who had been waiting with the particular contained restlessness of a child who wanted to see her parent and had been told to be patient, climbed immediately into the chair beside him and pressed her face against his shoulder. He put his arm around her without looking, the way you move toward something so familiar it didn't require thought. "I'm sorry I'm late, Bug," he said. "It's okay," Ava said, in a voice muffled by his shoulder. Victoria made soup. He looked at Victoria across the table. She had, in fact, made soup, or made an attempt at soup, which had required 3 separate phone calls to her friend Diane, who actually knew how to cook, and had resulted in something that looked approximately like soup and tasted, as far as she could judge, like soup. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Ava was hungry at 7 and you weren't here." It seemed like the practical response. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. "Thank you," he said, and meant it, and that was all. She put the soup on the table and they ate it without ceremony, and Ava announced that it was very good, and Ethan said it was good, and Victoria ate her own cooking and thought it was probably adequate at best. But the table was warm and Ava was chattering about something that had happened at school, and Ethan was listening with his arms still loose around his daughter's chair, and the soup was adequate, and for some reason that she did not let herself examine fully that night, it was enough. The call from Gerald came on Wednesday afternoon of the second week. She was in her room working through the shareholder contact list when his name came up on her phone. She answered expecting a routine update and heard instead the tight, careful quality in his voice that told her something had shifted. "Meridian has moved faster than we anticipated," he said. "They've approached 2 of the 4 institutional holders we flagged. Both have indicated they're open to conversations about selling their positions." "What positions are we talking about?" "Combined, about 14% of the group's outstanding equity." 14% was not controlling, but it was significant, and it was the start of an accumulation strategy. She knew how this went. Small positions, acquired quietly, until the number became too big to ignore and the boardroom dynamics changed. Who approached them? Was it Hale directly? A firm called Corvin Advisors. No direct connection to Meridian on paper. There's always a direct connection. We just haven't found it yet. She stood up from the desk. "I need the last 3 years of Corvin's transaction history, and I need it by tomorrow." "I'll try to get Gerald. Tomorrow." A pause. "Yes, tomorrow." She hung up and stood in the middle of the room and ran the numbers in her head, the way she always did. Not on paper, not in a spreadsheet, but in the private computational space behind her eyes where she'd always been fastest. 14%. The 2 shareholders Gerald had mentioned. The timeline of Meridian's previous plays against the group. The question of whether Ethan's debt absorption had triggered something in Hale that she and her father hadn't fully anticipated. Not just continued aggression, but accelerated aggression. The move of someone who felt a window closing. She needed to go to the group's office. She needed to sit in a room with the full legal team and work this properly. She went downstairs where Ava was on the couch doing homework with the television on at a low volume behind her. A configuration that Ethan apparently allowed because Ava had demonstrated, by some informal experiment Victoria hadn't witnessed, that she actually concentrated better this way. "I need to go to my office," Victoria said. "I'll be back before dinner." Ava looked up from her worksheet. "Roberta can watch me." "I know. I was telling you where I was going." She hesitated. "Do you want me to call Roberta, or—" "She's probably already watching from the window." Ava said this as a neutral fact, and then returned to her worksheet with the settled quality of a child who was fine. Victoria called Roberta on her way to the car. Roberta answered before the second ring. "I saw you coming out," she said. "I've got her." "Thank you." "You going to your office?" "Yes." "Good." A brief pause, and then in a different tone, "It's good that you went back. Don't let it go completely. That's not good for a person." Victoria stood beside her car and looked at Roberta's house for a moment. "That's not your concern." "No," Roberta agreed, without any offense. "Drive safe." The group's offices were in the financial district, 42 floors of familiar territory, and Victoria spent 4 hours in the conference room with 3 attorneys, and Gerald and a forensic accountant Gerald had quietly brought in without being asked, which told her Gerald was more worried than he'd let on over the phone. They took apart Corvin Advisors' transaction history. It took 2 hours to find the thread, a series of management fee arrangements that linked Corvin to a holding company that linked to a law firm that had represented Meridian Capital on 2 previous deals. Not a direct line, but a line nonetheless. Hale's fingerprints, faint but present. "We can use this," Victoria said. "Not legally. The connection is too indirect to constitute disclosure violations. But we can surface it informally to the shareholders Corvin has approached. Let them understand who they're actually dealing with. Reputationally, one of the attorneys said carefully. Reputationally, yes. We're not making allegations, we're providing relevant context for their decision-making. She looked around the table. Do we know if the two affected shareholders have signed anything yet? Not to our knowledge. Corvin's been in preliminary conversations only. Then we have a window. I'll contact both myself. She stood up, gathering papers, and then stopped. Gerald, the debt transfer, is it fully reflected in the public filing? As of Monday. Make sure the shareholders Corvin has approached are aware of it, specifically aware, not a general document dump. I want them to understand that the liability landscape has fundamentally changed. She left the building at 7:15 and sat in the back of a car heading toward Clairton, reviewing the documents she'd photographed on her phone, and didn't look up until the driver turned onto the familiar residential street and the character of the light outside the window changed from commercial to domestic, streetlights rather than office towers, the specific quiet of a neighborhood that had already finished its day. Ethan's truck was in the driveway. The downstairs lights were on. She went inside to find Ethan at the stove and Ava at the table doing something with crayons, and the kitchen smelled like garlic and something else warm, and Ava said, without looking up, "You're back." "I said I would be." "I know." She held up her drawing. "I drew Roberta's cat. Do you think it looks like a cat?" It looked less like a cat and more like an arrangement of orange ovals, but the intent was clearly feline. "It does," Victoria said, and Ava nodded with satisfaction and went back to it. Ethan glanced over his shoulder from the stove. He didn't ask where she'd been or what had happened or whether it was serious. He just said, "Dinner in 20. She sat down at the kitchen table across from Ava, still in her work clothes, heels on the linoleum, Corvin Advisors transaction history in her bag. Ava was drawing the cat, a companion now, another orange oval with legs, and humming something tuneless and completely unself-conscious. Victoria set her bag down, looked at the drawing. "Does Roberta's cat have a friend?" she asked. "His name is Walter," Ava said, pointing at the second oval. "He's the cat's cousin. They don't always get along, but they like each other." "That sounds complicated." "It is," Ava agreed with a seriousness that suggested she found complicated relationships entirely relatable. She looked at Victoria. "Did you have a hard day?" Victoria blinked. "What makes you ask that?" "You have a line." Ava pointed between her own eyebrows. "Here, Dad has it too when he has a hard day." Victoria touched her forehead without meaning to. "It goes away," Ava said helpfully. "Dad's always goes away at dinner." She went back to drawing Walter the cat's cousin, and Victoria sat with that for a moment, the absolute, unguarded simplicity of it, the particular way this child noticed things and said them without calculation. She was aware, sitting at that table, that something had shifted in the past 2 weeks in a way she hadn't tracked carefully enough to name. Not resolved. Nothing was resolved. The company was still under threat. The arrangement was still strange and defined and contractual and not what anyone would choose. She still did not belong in this house in any organic sense, but the line between Ethan's eyebrows went away at dinner. And Ava watched her drink coffee from the backyard and thought she was thinking about complicated things. And soup that was merely adequate had been enough, and Roberta had said fair enough, which was apparently a form of acceptance, and she had chopped herbs on a cutting board, and it had not been beneath her. She didn't do anything with these observations. She just noted them, the way she noted most things, carefully, without forcing a conclusion before the data was complete. Ethan put a plate in front of her without comment, and she picked up a fork. And outside the window, the oak tree stood in the darkening yard with the rope hanging from it perfectly still in the evening air. The shareholders held. Both of them. The two institutional holders that Corvin Advisors had approached, the one sitting on a combined 14% of the group's equity. Victoria had contacted them personally, not through attorneys, not through intermediaries, just direct phone calls in which she laid out the Corvin to Meridian connection with the same clean precision she brought to every negotiation that mattered. She didn't threaten. She didn't appeal to loyalty because loyalty was not a reliable currency in institutional investing. She presented facts and context and let both men understand, without anything being said explicitly, that whoever they sold to was Douglas Hale, and whatever Hale told them about the group's prospects was a story he was telling to serve his own acquisition play. Both held. Both. She found out on a Thursday morning, 2.5 weeks into her life in Clairton, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee while Ava ate cereal and told her something complicated about a disagreement she'd had with her best friend at school, whose name was Priya, and who had, apparently, claimed that purple was a better color than blue, which Ava found both wrong and personally offensive. Gerald's text came while Ava was mid-sentence. Both confirmed holding, no further Corvin contact. Victoria read it, set the phone face down on the table, and said, "Why is blue better than purple?" Ava looked at her with an expression of profound vindication. "It's just more. You know? Blue is the sky and the ocean. Purple is some flowers, and that's it." That seems like a reasonable position. Priya doesn't think so. Priya is wrong, Victoria said, which was a more definitive statement than she'd intended, and Ava laughed the way she laughed when something landed exactly right, full and unguarded, and Victoria felt the warmth of it move through the kitchen like a current. She picked up her phone and texted Gerald back. "Good. Watch for secondary approaches." Hale doesn't stop at the first no. Then she put her phone away and finished her coffee. Set. She told Ethan about the shareholder situation that night, not because she owed him an update. Technically, the debt arrangement gave him financial interest in the company's stability, but they had no formal information-sharing structure. But because she found, when she sat down to think about it, that she wanted to tell someone, and the person she was living with was the only person who had been present for any of it. He was on the back porch when she found him, sitting in one of the 2 old wooden chairs with a bottle of beer and the specific stillness of a man who had been working since 6:30 in the morning and had earned the right to sit quietly in the dark for a while. The yard was dark except for the porch light throwing a circle that didn't reach the fence, and the oak tree was a shape rather than a detail, and somewhere down the block someone was mowing a lawn late. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he heard the screen door and turned. "Sorry," she said. "I can leave you." "Sit down," he said. Not unfriendly, just direct. She sat in the second chair, which was slightly uneven on the porch boards, and rocked, very slightly, when she settled into it. She had changed out of her work clothes. She'd started doing this in the evenings, which was a small and probably irrelevant shift, but she noticed it. And she was in plain dark pants and a gray pullover that was loose enough to be comfortable, which was a garment she owned primarily for travel and had not worn at home in years. "I talked to both shareholders today," she said. "The ones Meridian was approaching. They're holding." He nodded slowly, looking at the yard. "Hale back off?" "For now. He'll try something else." "Yeah." He took a drink. "He sounds like the kind of person who takes a loss and regroups." "He is exactly that kind of person." She paused. "Do you know him?" "Not personally. I know the type." She looked at him sidelong. "You know the type." He was quiet for a moment, in the way he sometimes got quiet. Not evasive, she had come to understand, but actually thinking. There was a distinction, and it had taken her 2 weeks to calibrate it. "There are people who build things and people who take things," he said finally. Hale is the second kind. He spent his whole career finding companies that other people built and finding ways to take them apart for the pieces. That's a reasonably sophisticated read of a man you've never met. "I read too." He glanced at her, and there was the faint version of something in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the preparation for one, the muscle memory of it. "You said that to me at the coffee shop." "I remember." "You seemed surprised then too." She said nothing to that because he was right, and there was no point in constructing a defense. She sat in the uneven chair and looked at the yard and listened to the distant lawnmower wind down into silence. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "The terms of the arrangement, the debt absorption, the capital structure, all of it." She chose her words with some care, the same care she used when she was approaching something she genuinely didn't know the answer to. That document was not put together by a garage owner who called a lawyer one afternoon. Whoever drafted it understood the group's liability architecture in a level of detail that required either an exceptional attorney or someone with significant personal expertise. He was quiet. "I'm not asking because I think there's something wrong with it," she continued. "The arrangement has been straightforwardly beneficial. I'm asking because I have been trying to understand who you actually are for 3 weeks, and the information available doesn't add up to the person I'm looking at. The lawnmower was gone. The block was quiet. Inside the house, through the walls, she could faintly hear the sound of the television. Ava was still up, just barely, watching the 20 minutes of allowed evening television that Ethan permitted on school nights. "You'll know when there's something to know," he said. "That's not an answer." "I know it's not." He looked at her directly. "I'm not asking you to be patient because I'm hiding something bad. I'm asking because some things need the right moment, and this isn't it yet." She held his gaze. She was a person who did not tolerate incomplete information well. It was one of her known professional liabilities, the thing that made her push in negotiations when a more patient operator would wait. But there was something in the way he said yet that she found, against her usual instincts, genuinely credible. Not a dodge, a deferral with intention behind it. "All right," she said. He seemed slightly surprised that she'd accepted it without pushing further. He looked back at the yard. They sat in the 2 uneven chairs in the porch light until the television sound inside went quiet, which meant Ava had been put to bed, and then a little past that, not talking much, just occupying the same space in a way that had stopped being uncomfortable without either of them quite marking the moment it changed. The 4th week brought the first real rupture. It started over something small, because most real ruptures started over something small. The underlying pressure had been building independently of the small thing. It was just that the small thing happened to be the first crack in the surface that let it through. The small thing was a school event. Ava's school had a family showcase, an afternoon in the gymnasium where children displayed projects they'd worked on, and parents and family members came to look and ask questions and eat the cookies that the 2nd grade class had made. Ava had been working on her project for 2 weeks, a poster about the water cycle that she'd covered in drawings of clouds and rivers with arrows that didn't quite go the right direction but showed clear ambition. She had mentioned it at dinner multiple times. She had asked Victoria twice whether she thought rain was more interesting than snow, which Victoria now understood was research rather than casual conversation. 3 days before the showcase, Ethan came home later than usual with the look on his face that meant a job had gone wrong at the garage, in a way that would take days to resolve. A customer dispute about a repair bill, she gathered from the fragments of a phone conversation she hadn't been trying to hear. A transmission job, money owed, the kind of grinding interpersonal conflict that small business owners navigated constantly and that no one with larger resources ever had to think about. The showcase was on a Thursday afternoon. Wednesday night, Ethan told Ava he might not make it. Victoria was in the kitchen when he told her. She watched Ava's face do the thing it did when it received information it wasn't ready for. A brief, private struggle, quickly covered, because Ava was 6 years old and had learned already, through the particular education that loss gave children, not to put all of her weight on a single thing. "It's okay," Ava said. She went back to her dinner. "I'm going to try," Ethan said. "If the customer comes in the morning like he said, it's okay, Dad." She said it again with a flatness that was worse than the first time, because the first time had been a response, and the second time was a door closing. Ethan looked at his plate. He was tired, and he was carrying the weight of the garage dispute, and he looked like a man doing the math on too many obligations simultaneously. Victoria did not say anything at the table. But after Ava was in bed, she came downstairs and found him at the kitchen table with the garage's accounts open on a laptop, and she sat down across from him without being invited. "I'll be there," she said. He looked up. "At the showcase. If you can't make it, I'll go." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face that was difficult to read. Not suspicion, but something more complicated than gratitude. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't. I'm saying I will. She'll notice if you're going because I couldn't—" "Ethan." She said his name for the first time without the particular care she'd been taking around it, and he registered that. She could see it. "I'm not a substitute for you. I'm not trying to fill a gap. I'll be there because she worked on that poster for 2 weeks and someone who was paying attention should see it. That's all." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a different voice than usual, quieter, without the contained quality she'd come to think of as his default register. "Thank you." It was the second time he'd said it and meant it, and like the first time, it was just those 2 words, No performance around them, and it landed with a weight that two-word sentences didn't usually carry. Talk. The customer came in Thursday morning, which meant the dispute might resolve, which meant Ethan might make it after all. He texted her at noon. Customer in. Might be there by 2:30. The showcase started at 2. She went at 2 anyway. The gymnasium of Ava's school smelled the way all elementary school gymnasiums smelled. A particular combination of industrial cleaner and old floor, and the faint ghost of every physical education class that had ever happened in the room. Folding tables were set up in rows, each with a child standing beside their project, and the room was full of parents and grandparents and the specific ambient noise of people trying to have conversations while children talked over them. Victoria found Ava's table in the second row. Ava was standing beside her water cycle poster in a yellow dress that Victoria recognized from the laundry she had done earlier in the week, a dress Ava wore for events she considered important, and she was already in conversation with someone else's parent, explaining her arrows with the full force of her personality. She saw Victoria, and her face did something that Victoria was not prepared for. Not just recognition, something more than recognition. A specific, uncomplicated gladness, the expression of a person for whom your arrival had genuinely mattered, without complication, without condition. "You came," she said, as if this was wonderful and also slightly amazing. "I said I would," Victoria said. Ava grabbed her hand, just took it, the way children took hands without asking, without negotiating the meaning of the gesture, and pulled her toward the poster with something very close to urgency. Okay, so this is the water cycle. You already know what the water cycle is probably, but let me explain the arrows because my teacher said the arrows are a little confusing, but I think they make sense if you understand my system. Victoria stood beside Ava's project and let herself be explained to, and she listened and she asked actual questions, and Ava answered them with genuine scientific investment, and at some point Victoria became aware that her hand was still in Ava's, because Ava had not let go. And she had not let go either. Ethan arrived at 2:47. She saw him come through the gymnasium doors. He'd changed his shirt but not his jeans, and there was something at his collar that was probably residual grease, and he was looking for them. And when he found them, something in his face shifted in a way that she felt rather than saw, the particular relief of a father who had made it. Ava saw him a second later and said, "Dad!" with the kind of volume that made several people turn and let go of Victoria's hand to run across the gymnasium, and Ethan caught her and held her for a moment with both arms, and then she was pulling him back toward the poster to explain the arrows again, and Victoria stood to one side and watched the two of them together. She thought about the obituary. 5 sentences. Beloved by everyone who knew her. The woman whose absence was a shape in this family. Not a wound anymore, or not only a wound but a presence of its own kind. The outline of someone who had been and was not, and around whose edges this man had rebuilt something whole enough for a child to grow up inside of. She didn't say any of this. She just stood to the side and watched, and Ava explained the arrows for the 3rd time, and Ethan listened as if he was hearing them for the first time, which was the particular talent of a parent who understood that the explaining was the point. The rupture, when it came, arrived 2 days later, which was a Saturday. She should have seen it coming. She had been trained to see things coming, and the signs had been present if she'd been paying attention to the right register. Ethan had been increasingly quiet since Thursday. Not cold, not distant in any pointed way, but turned inward in a manner she was learning to recognize as something he did when he was working through something he hadn't yet decided how to handle. She had assumed it was the garage dispute, which had apparently resolved but left residue. She had been wrong. Saturday morning, Ava was at Roberta's, a standing arrangement on weekends, 2 or 3 hours in the morning, during which Roberta taught Ava to cook things that were mostly successful, and during which Ethan did household maintenance. Victoria was at the kitchen table with her laptop, working through a shareholder briefing document, when Ethan came in from outside where he'd been doing something with the fence. He stood in the kitchen doorway, and she knew immediately from the quality of his stillness that this was not a practical conversation. "Can we talk about something?" he said. She closed the laptop. "Sit down." He sat. He had a way of sitting that was different from the way most men she knew sat in chairs. He didn't spread or claim space the way professional men often did, didn't perform any ease. He just sat, and he looked at her directly, and she noted that the line was between his eyebrows. "I heard your conversation with Gerald," he said. She kept her face still. "Which one?" "Monday. The one about the shareholders and the Corvin connection." He set his hands flat on the table. "You were in the hallway by the stairs and the kitchen carries sound." "I know it does." "You identified a connection between Corvin and Meridian that two separate law firms hadn't found." He was watching her face. "That's not a CEO working her family's company. That's someone who knows how to do forensic financial work at a level that most CFOs couldn't manage." "I've been doing this for a long time." "That's not what I mean." He paused. "I mean the way you talked about it. The Corvin transaction history, the holding company layers, the management fee structure. That was fluent. You didn't learn that at the Sinclair Group. You were trained in it somewhere." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird was making a sound in the oak tree. From down the block came the distant sound of a child, not Ava, someone else's child, doing something loud and Saturday morning appropriate. "Westfield Consulting," she said, "before I came back to the group. I spent 4 years doing acquisition forensics. We worked on hostile takeover defenses, regulatory compliance investigations, financial structure analysis for clients under various types of predatory pressure." She looked at him. "I was good at it. I was going to make partner. Then my father asked me to come back, and I did." "You gave it up." "I made a choice." "Was it a choice?" She looked at him for a long moment. "What do you mean?" "I mean, did you choose it, or did you not really have another option, given who your father is and what the company meant to him and what he expected from you?" The directness of it was almost startling. Not aggressive, genuinely direct. The way he'd been at the coffee shop, the way he was with everything, apparently, which she still hadn't fully calibrated to. She found herself in the unusual position of not having a prepared answer, because no one had asked her this question in precisely this way before. "Somewhere between the two," she said at last. He nodded, like that was a true answer, and he recognized it as one. "I'm not trying to dig into your life," he said. "I'm trying to understand something." "What?" "You've been here almost 4 weeks. You've been—" He stopped, tried again. "You've been good with Ava. Better than good. You've handled the company situation from here, from this kitchen table, and you've handled it well. And every time I think I have a sense of who you actually are, there's another layer." She held his gaze. "I could say the same to you." "Yeah." He acknowledged it without deflecting. "You could. You said I'd know when there was something to know." "I know I said that. Is now the right moment?" He looked at her. The morning light was coming in through the window over the sink, the particular quality of late morning light on a Saturday in early autumn, and it fell across the table between them and made the ordinary surfaces of the kitchen look somehow more deliberate than usual. "Not quite yet," he said. "I'm sorry. You keep apologizing for not telling me something." "Because I know it's not fair." "Then why not just tell me?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer, and she was preparing to say something or leave the table when he said, "Because I'm not sure who you are yet either. And what I have to tell you is something that changes the way people see me. Every time. Without exception." His voice was entirely steady. "I need to know what you see first before that. I need to know the ground we're standing on is real." The kitchen was very quiet. She thought about the coffee shop 3 weeks ago. "I'm not looking for a performance. I'm not interested in someone who's going to move in and spend 6 months trying to get back out." She thought about Ava's hand in hers in the gymnasium, uncomplicated and unasked for. She thought about adequate soup and the line between the eyebrows that went away at dinner. "The ground is real," she said quietly, and she meant it, and she was surprised by how completely she meant it. Something moved across his face, not relief, more the quality of something that had been held tightly, being held slightly less tightly. He said nothing. But he reached across the table and set his hand briefly over hers, not squeezing, not holding, just present for a moment. And then he stood up and said he was going to make lunch. And she opened her laptop again and pretended to work for a few minutes while the kitchen filled with the sound of him moving around behind her, and she did not look at her hand where it rested on the table. 2 days later, Meridian moved again. She got the call from Gerald at 6:15 in the morning, while she was still at the kitchen table with her first coffee, and the house was not yet awake. His voice had the specific quality it had developed for delivering bad news: clipped, factual, moving through information without pausing in the places where pausing would have to acknowledge what the information meant. Meridian has filed a derivative lawsuit, he said, against the board, nominally, but the practical target is the family's management of the group over the past 24 months. They're claiming breach of fiduciary duty, failure to act in shareholder interests, and, he paused on this one, fraudulent concealment. The last one was the weapon. The first two were noise. Fraudulent concealment meant Hale was alleging that the group's management had hidden information from shareholders, the depth of the financial losses, the timeline of the insolvency risk, potentially the circumstances of the debt arrangement. It was a claim designed not to win in court, but to trigger regulatory scrutiny, shake institutional confidence, and give the shareholders Meridian had been approaching a legal justification to reconsider their positions. He's filing it publicly? The press release is already drafted. My contact at his firm told me it goes out this morning. She set down her coffee. How long do we have? Maybe 2 hours. Get the litigation team into the building by 8. I'll be there by 7:30. She stood up, already moving toward the stairs. And Gerald? Start preparing the chronology. Every decision, every communication, every disclosure from the past 24 months. If he wants to make a case for fraudulent concealment, I want to be able to put 40 linear feet of compliant documentation in front of a court before noon. She was upstairs and changing when she heard Ethan's door open across the hall, and then his footstep pausing just outside hers, which was open a few inches. You have to go in, he said. Yes. She pulled on her jacket. Something's developed. It's significant. How bad? She stopped. Looked at him through the gap of the door. He was in a t-shirt and the jeans he'd apparently already put on, which meant he'd heard her on the phone. His face was fully awake, which meant he'd been awake before it. Bad enough that I need to be in that building before the press release drops, she said. The lawsuit isn't winnable for him, but it doesn't need to be. It's a pressure play. He was quiet for a moment. What can I do? The question surprised her. Not because it was offered. She was learning that this was how he operated, practical and direct. But because of how much she wanted to give him an actual answer instead of the professional deflection she'd have given anyone else who asked it. Ava, she said, I don't know when I'll be back. I've got her. Go. She finished buttoning her jacket and picked up her bag. He stepped back from the doorway to let her pass, and as she went by him in the narrow hallway, she was close enough to him that she was aware, with a sudden and inconveniently clear awareness, of exactly how close they were. And then she was past him and on the stairs and moving, because moving was what she knew how to do when everything else was uncertain. The press release dropped at 8:04. By then, Victoria was already in the conference room with the litigation team, and she had already reviewed the full complaint, and she had already identified the 3 places where Hale's legal team had overreached in their fraud allegations. The dates were wrong on 2 of the disclosure claims, and the third hinged on an interpretation of a board resolution that any competent judge would read differently. He filed this himself, she said, reading through the complaint for the 3rd time. He didn't go through outside litigation counsel. This is in-house work. Do you see the disclosure dates? The lead litigator, a woman named Patricia, who had worked on the group's legal team for 8 years, leaned over and looked. November 18th. The actual disclosure was November 12th, 6 days earlier. That's not ambiguous. It's in the public filing, time-stamped. She looked up. He built his primary fraud claim on a date that's factually incorrect. Either his team didn't check, or they checked and thought no one would notice, or they filed this in such a hurry that the due diligence was incomplete. The hurry, Patricia said, with a certain satisfaction. The debt arrangement rattled him. He's moving faster than he should. Which means we can make him look sloppy in front of the same shareholders he's been courting. Victoria straightened. I want a formal response filed by noon. Lead with the date discrepancy. I want it clean. No rhetorical excess, no triumphalism, just facts. Hale's complaint contains material errors, and here they are, in sequence, with supporting documentation. By 11, the response was drafted. By 1:15, it was filed. By 2:45, the first of the institutional shareholders that Meridian had approached sent a terse email to Gerald saying they had reviewed the filing and would not be engaging further with Corvin advisors or their principals. Victoria read the email in the back of a car heading back to Clairton, and she let herself feel, for approximately 45 seconds, the particular clean satisfaction of having won something on merit, without advantage, on the strength of actually knowing the material better than the person who had come after her. Then she put her phone in her bag and looked out the window. The city gave way to suburb, and suburb gave way to the familiar residential character of Clairton, and by the time the car turned onto the street, she found herself noticing, with a precision that would have surprised her a month ago, that Ethan's truck was in the driveway, which meant he was already home, which meant he had probably collected Ava from school himself. She went inside to find the two of them at the kitchen table with what appeared to be a partially assembled model of something. A plane, maybe, or a rocket. It was difficult to tell at this stage. And Ava explaining something very technical and probably not entirely accurate about aerodynamics. And Ethan listening with full attention while his hands held two pieces of the model at the angle he'd been directed to hold them. He looked up when she came in. "Well?" he said. "We filed the response," she said. "Hale's complaint has material errors. The first shareholder has already pulled back." Something in his face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "Yeah?" "He moved too fast." She set her bag down. "He made a mistake." "People who are scared make mistakes," Ethan said. He looked at her steadily. "Including the good ones." She didn't know exactly what he meant by that, or rather, she suspected she knew and wasn't ready to examine it directly. So she didn't. She looked at the model on the table. "What is that supposed to be?" "It's a space shuttle," Ava said with emphasis. "Obviously, you can tell because of the wings. The wings are not yet attached." "We're getting to the wings," Ava said. "Dad's holding the body while I find the wing piece, which I know I put somewhere." She began looking through the small pile of model parts with great purpose, and Victoria sat down at the table in her work clothes with her heels still on the linoleum, and Ethan was still holding the body of the model at the precise angle Ava had specified, and she looked at the table covered in model pieces, and something moved through her that she didn't name, not then, because naming it required a courage she wasn't quite there yet. But it was there. That was the thing. It was there, sitting quiet in the kitchen with the afternoon light across the table and the sound of Ava looking for the wing piece, not asking to be named, just present, the way the maple tree was present outside the bedroom window every morning, the way adequate soup had been enough, the way the line between the eyebrows went away at dinner. It was there, and she felt it, and she let herself feel it without doing anything about it. For now, that was enough. The space shuttle got finished on Sunday. Ava put the last piece on herself, a small nose cone that had rolled under the refrigerator and required Ethan to move the refrigerator 18 inches while Ava directed the operation. And she held it up in the kitchen light with the satisfaction of someone who had seen a project through every complication it had thrown at her, which was, Victoria was beginning to understand, a characteristic Ava shared with her father. Victoria was at the table watching when it happened, a cup of tea going cold beside her laptop, and when Ava held up the finished shuttle, she made a sound of genuine triumph that filled the kitchen in a way that was disproportionate to the occasion and exactly proportionate to what it meant to Ava. And Ethan said, "There it is," in a quiet voice, and the whole small moment was so unremarkable and so completely itself that Victoria found she had stopped pretending to work without noticing. She was still finding those moments, the ones that caught her without warning, that had no particular drama but landed with a weight she hadn't assigned them. She had been here 6 weeks now. 6 weeks and some days, which she had stopped counting with the same precision she'd used in the first 2 weeks, which was itself a change she registered without making anything of. The company's situation had stabilized, at least temporarily. Hale's lawsuit was moving through preliminary motions, bleeding his own resources and public credibility in the process. The date discrepancy she'd identified had been picked up by 2 financial press outlets, which had been professionally embarrassing for Meridian's legal team. The institutional shareholders were holding. Gerald had reported that Corvin advisors had gone quiet. It was not a permanent resolution, but it was ground-held, and in the world Victoria operated in, ground-held was what you worked with while you planned the next position. She had been back to the group's offices 4 times in the past 3 weeks. Each time she went, she came back to Clareton by early evening, which was not something she had consciously decided, but had become, without announcement, the pattern. Each time she came back, Ava was either home or at Roberta's, and Ethan was either cooking or doing something in the yard or reading. He read more than she had expected, physical books, not a tablet or a phone, and she had learned by degrees that his reading covered a range that was frankly startling for reasons she was still in the process of working out. She had stopped asking about what he wasn't telling her, not because she'd given up wanting to know, but because she had begun to trust, tentatively and with the particular caution of someone who had been disappointed by trusting before, that he would tell her when he said he would. The ground is real, she had said. She was trying to live that. Quote. The thing that broke open the next layer of the story was a phone call she wasn't supposed to hear. It was a Wednesday evening, the beginning of week 7. She had come home from an afternoon meeting with Patricia's litigation team and was in the kitchen starting water for pasta because Ethan had texted at 4:30 to say he was running late, and she had responded without thinking much about it that she would handle dinner. She had gotten better at cooking in the past month, not dramatically better, but competently better. The improvement that came from watching someone who actually knew what they were doing and from Ava's direct and unsentimental feedback, which was the most honest culinary criticism she had ever received. She had the water going and was cutting something when she heard Ethan's truck in the driveway, earlier than she'd expected. She heard the truck door. A pause, longer than the usual pause between the truck and the front door. She wasn't paying attention to it particularly until she realized the pause was extending, which meant he was still outside, which meant the call he was on was something he didn't want to bring inside. She wasn't trying to listen. The kitchen window was open because the evening was mild, and his voice carried. She caught fragments rather than a full conversation, because she did go back to cutting what she'd been cutting rather than standing at the window because that distinction mattered to her. But fragments were enough. Told you I'm handling it. I understand what's at stake, Marcus. I've understood what's at stake for 6 years. The arrangement has nothing to do with the other matter. They're separate. And then, several minutes later, quieter, in a voice with something in it she had not heard from him before. A controlled tension, the sound of a person keeping a lid on something that wanted to be louder. When it's time, I'll tell her. That's my call, not yours. Then the truck door again, and then the front door, and then his footsteps in the hall. He came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw dinner in progress. He had changed his expression by then. She could see him choosing to put it away, which was a thing he was good at. But she was also good at reading rooms, and she had just heard what she'd heard, and the combination of both told her something had shifted. You're earlier than you said, she offered. Customer canceled. He looked at the stove, at what she was making. You didn't have to. I said I would. She kept cutting. Long drive back? A half beat. Made a couple calls. She did not say what she'd heard. She was not ready to say it, and he was not ready to say it, and Ava was going to be home from Roberta's in 20 minutes, so she filed it in the place she was keeping an increasing number of things about Ethan Brooks, the place that was not suspicious, but was paying close attention. Dinner was quiet in the specific way dinners were quiet, when two adults were both processing something they hadn't said to each other yet. Ava covered most of the noise, reporting on a disagreement at Roberta's about the correct way to make biscuits, which had apparently been vigorous enough that Roberta had called Ava's biscuit technique creative, which Ava took as a compliment, and Roberta had probably not entirely meant as one. After Ava was in bed, Victoria poured herself a glass of water in the kitchen and found Ethan sitting on the back porch, which had become, over the past few weeks, a shared space in the evenings without either of them having formally decided it. She went out and sat in the second chair and said nothing for a while. The yard was dark and the oak tree was a shape, and it was cooler than it had been, a real autumn cool, and she had not brought anything to wear over her shirt, so she sat with her arms crossed slightly, which was not for warmth so much as something to do with her hands. I heard some of your call, she said, after a while. He was quiet. I wasn't trying to. The window was open. I know. His voice told her he'd already known she'd heard something. Marcus, she said. Someone named Marcus who has opinions about the arrangement and what you tell me. He exhaled slowly. Not a sigh. more like someone releasing something they'd been holding in their chest. He's my attorney. Your attorney has opinions about our marriage arrangement. He has opinions about everything. He turned his head toward her. He thinks I've waited too long to tell you. Tell me what? He looked at her for a long moment in the specific way she had come to know, the looking that was actually thinking, that was deciding. She waited, because she had learned that pushing in these moments cost more than it gained. My full name, he said at last, is Ethan Brooks Caulfield. She processed that. Caulfield. My father was Lawrence Caulfield. The name landed with a delayed impact, the way some names did when they were so large that the mind needed a moment to locate them properly. Lawrence Caulfield. Lawrence Caulfield had been one of the three most significant private equity architects of the past 40 years. The man who had built the Caulfield Group from a regional investment vehicle into a firm that managed north of $80 billion in assets at its peak. He had died 6 years ago, and the financial world had written about it for weeks. Lawrence Caulfield was your father, she said. Yes. And you own a garage. I own a garage. He said it without irony, without defensiveness, just a fact that sat alongside the other fact. When my father died, I walked away from the firm. My older brother runs it now, has for 6 years. She stared at him. She was doing the thing she did when too much information arrived too quickly, not shutting down but slowing deliberately, forcing the analysis to be systematic rather than reactive. Why? Because I watched my father build something that took everything from him, every relationship he had, every version of himself that wasn't the business. My mother left when I was 12 because she said she was married to a company and not a man. He stopped, looked at the yard. I met Claire when I was 26. She was a pediatric nurse. She had nothing to do with any of that world. She thought I was just some guy. I let her think that for 3 months before I told her, and those 3 months were the first time in my adult life I'd been with someone who was seeing me. He paused. We were together for 5 years before she got sick. The garage was mine before that. I started it when I walked away from the firm. It was never supposed to be a cover or a story. It's just what I wanted. Victoria sat very still. The cold was actual now, not just something to do with her hands, but she didn't move. The capital for the arrangement, she said. It came from my share of the Caulfield estate. There's an independent trust that Marcus manages. I don't touch most of it. He turned to look at her. The debt absorption was real. The terms were fair. You said so yourself. I didn't use the Caulfield name because I wanted to know, if I'd value you for your character rather than your status, she said. She heard her own voice saying it and recognized it immediately. It was almost word for word what the outline of this arrangement had promised, the logic underneath the whole thing, and hearing herself say it out loud in the specific context of this back porch on this autumn night made it land differently than it would have on paper. Yes, he said quietly. She stood up. Not out of anger. She assessed herself for anger and found something more complicated. She walked to the edge of the porch and stood looking at the yard, arms crossed against the cold now for actual reasons. You let me think you were a mechanic. I am a mechanic. The garage is real. The work is real. Ethan. His name again with that specific force. You know what I mean. I know. A pause. I'm not going to pretend it was a clean thing to do. It wasn't. I built the whole arrangement on an incomplete truth, and I did it deliberately, and I knew it was going to come out, and I knew it was going to be a problem when it did. She turned around. Then why? Because every relationship I've had since Claire died, every person who knew who I actually was, treated me like the money first and the man second, every single one. His voice was still steady, but there was something underneath it now, something that had weight. I have a daughter. She's 6 years old and she needs a mother figure who wants to be her mother, not a woman who wants access to the Caulfield estate through a child. And I needed to know, I genuinely needed to know whether you could be in this house and find it worth being in. Whether you'd come to that school and hold her hand at the showcase because you wanted to be there, not because you found out whose name I was born with. The yard was quiet. The oak tree moved slightly in the breeze. That wasn't your call to make, she said. Her voice was flat in the way it got when she was keeping control of something that wanted to be louder. You made a decision about what I could handle and what I could be trusted with. You made it unilaterally before you even met me properly. Yes, I did. That's not honest. You said honest, not easy, but that wasn't honest. No, he said, it wasn't. The acknowledgement without defense, without counter-argument, without the deflection that most people used when they were cornered, it disarmed her in a way she hadn't braced for. She stood at the edge of the porch and looked at him sitting in the chair, and she felt the full complicated weight of what she was feeling, which was not one thing. It was anger, yes, the clean kind that came from being handled without consent. It was also something else, something that had been growing for 6 weeks in the kitchen and at the dinner table and in the gymnasium and on this porch, and that something did not care very much about the name Caulfield or the $80 billion or any of the rest of it. That was the most inconvenient part. I need to think, she said. I know. She went inside, upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed in the room with the maple tree window and pressed her palms flat on her thighs and looked at the ceiling. She thought about everything she'd observed over 6 weeks. The transmission job that ran long and the look on his face when he told Ava he might not make the showcase. The adequate soup and the 2 words of genuine gratitude. The way he cooked not to demonstrate anything, but because his daughter had decided his cooking tasted better, and that had been enough reason. The 5 sentences of an obituary. He always comes back for dinner. The back porch in the evenings. The hand flat over hers for a moment on the kitchen table. None of those things were the Caulfield name. All of those things were Ethan. She sat with that for a long time. She did not come back downstairs that night. She heard him move around the house below her, heard him check the doors, heard him pause at the foot of the stairs for a moment, heard him go back to his room. She lay in bed with the window and the maple tree, which moved in the autumn wind with the particular sound of leaves going dry at their edges, and she did not sleep for a long time. When she did sleep, she dreamed nothing memorable. In the morning, she came downstairs at 5:40 as always, and he was already in the kitchen, which was not unusual, and they stood in the kitchen together with the coffee machine running between them, and neither of them said anything for a while. Ava came down at 7 and demanded to know whether she could bring the space shuttle to school for show and tell, and the ordinary morning machinery of the household ground into motion around the 2 of them. And in the middle of Ava's negotiation about the shuttle, Victoria looked across the kitchen and found Ethan watching her. And what was in his face was not hope exactly. He was too careful for hope, she understood that now. But something in the neighborhood of it, something that had stayed up through the night and was still here in the morning, because that was the kind of person he was. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said to Ava, "The shuttle should stay home. It took too long to build to risk the bus." Ava considered this with genuine deliberation. "That's a fair point," she allowed. And the morning continued, and nothing was resolved, and nothing was the same. The resolution, when it came slowly and without fanfare, because that was how most real things came. She spent 2 days in a private and not particularly comfortable reckoning with what she'd been told. She went to the group's offices on Thursday, sat through a litigation update with Patricia, had lunch with Gerald, in which she was probably worse company than usual, and returned to Clareton in the early evening to find Ethan's truck in the driveway and Ava in the backyard attempting to teach the rope in the oak tree a lesson about cooperation, which the rope was declining to learn. She changed her clothes and went out to the backyard, which she had been doing most evenings, and stood beside the oak tree watching Ava wrestle with the rope. "It won't go where I want," Ava said, without preamble. "What do you want it to do?" "I want it to swing, but it's going in circles instead." She demonstrated, spinning the rope. It went, indeed, in circles. "That's because you're spinning it rather than pulling it away from the tree." Victoria looked at the rope. "If you pull it toward you first, then let go. It will swing instead of spin." Ava tried this. The rope swung. Her face went electric. "How did you know that?" "Physics," Victoria said. "You could probably explain it better than me once you think about it." Ava sat with that for a moment, swinging the rope back and forth, and then she said, in the particular tone she used when she was coming at something sideways, "Are you and Dad okay?" Victoria looked at her. "Why do you ask?" Because you're both being quieter than usual, and quiet means something's happening. She did not look at Victoria while she said this, which was a technique Victoria recognized as a child's version of giving someone room. Roberta says when people are quiet, it usually means they're figuring something out. Roberta says a lot of things. She's usually right. Ava gave the rope another pull. Are you figuring something out? Yes, Victoria said, because lying to this child was something she had discovered she was congenitally incapable of. Both of us are. Ava nodded, as if this was the answer she'd expected, and it was satisfactory. That's okay, she said. Dad takes a while to figure things out, but he always does. She abandoned the rope and went to look for something under the porch, having completed, apparently, whatever she'd needed from the conversation, and Victoria stood under the oak tree in the autumn cool and thought about what a 6-year-old had just told her, which was the same thing Ethan had said in the kitchen on Saturday morning, said without knowing it, said in the absolute authority of a child who had watched her father her whole life and believed in him completely. He always comes back. She found him in the garage, not the auto repair garage, but the small detached garage behind the house that he used for his own projects. She had been in it once, briefly, early in the first week, and had registered a workbench and tools and something large under a tarp. She knocked on the door, which was open. He looked up from the workbench. He was doing something with a small engine part, a precise and focused task, and he set it down when she came in. The something under the tarp was still there. She had never asked. The motorcycle under there, she said. Is that yours? He looked at the tarp. It was my father's. He wrote it twice and put it away. I've been working on it for 2 years. A beat. It's almost done. She filed that. The man who walked away from his father's empire and spent 2 years quietly restoring the one personal thing his father had owned and barely used. She didn't say anything about what she filed. I've been angry about it, she said, instead, getting to the point. The fact that you didn't tell me. I want to be clear that the anger was real and is real. I know it is. What you did was a kind of manipulation. Even if the intention behind it wasn't bad, the method was. You made a decision about what I was allowed to know about the person I was agreeing to live with. That's not nothing. You're right, he said. No qualification. But she stopped because the but was the harder part, the part that required admitting something about the last 6 weeks. But I've been here long enough to understand the difference between the fact that you withheld something and who you actually are. And whatever you withheld about the name and the money, the rest of it has been honest. Everything I've seen here has been honest. He said nothing. She could hear the quality of his silence, the held quality. I'm not going to pretend I'm not affected by knowing, she continued. I grew up in that world. I know exactly what the Caulfield name means. I know what the estate means, and I know enough about myself to know that I would have entered this arrangement differently if I'd known from the beginning, and that the different way I would have entered it would not have been better. It would have been more guarded, more strategic. She looked at him. I would have missed everything I actually found here. Something moved across his face. Not victory. There was no version of Ethan Brooks that took a moment like this as a victory. Something more careful than that. I'm still angry, she said. That's fair. I'm also... She stopped. This was the part that required the most courage, and she was not a person who used words like courage lightly, and she was using it here because it was accurate. I'm also aware that at some point in the last 6 weeks, this stopped being an arrangement I was tolerating and became something I don't want to leave. She met his eyes. I needed you to know that, separate from everything else. The garage was very quiet. Outside, she could hear Ava somewhere in the yard, probably testing the rope physics. Ethan stood at the workbench for a moment, and then he came around it, and he stopped in front of her at a distance that was close but not presuming, and she looked up at him because he was taller and she was not wearing heels. I should have told you sooner, he said. Not just the name, all of it. I should have trusted the ground sooner. Yes, she said. You should have. I'm sorry for the way I handled it. Not for why. I'd make the same decision about wanting to know who you really were before you knew who I really was, but the execution was wrong. She looked at him for a long moment. The execution was very wrong, she said, and something in her voice had shifted, not softened, but unlocked, the quality she never let herself have in professional contexts, the quality she had been keeping carefully contained in this house for 6 weeks and was now, in the small yellow light of a garage in Clareton, allowing. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so quiet and so personal that it landed somewhere in her chest with a precision that surprised her. And then he said, "I'm going to keep being wrong about things. I'm not—" "I know," she said. "I know you're not perfect. I'm really not. Neither am I." "I know," he said, and there was something in it that told her he actually knew, not as a polite agreement, but as a thing he'd been paying the same quality of attention to that she'd been paying to him. "I've been watching you for 6 weeks." "I know," she said, and she almost smiled. "I've been watching you too." He kissed her once, carefully, the kind of kiss that asked a question and waited for an actual answer, and her answer was the way she didn't step back. And after a moment he rested his forehead against hers in the particular way that was not romantic in any performed sense, but was so intimate that she felt the edge of something she had been protecting in herself for a very long time. They stood like that in the garage for a while, in the small yellow light, and outside Ava called from the yard, "Dad, the rope is working," with the triumphant volume of a child who had solved something, and they both laughed, which was not planned and could not have been. And then Ethan called back, "That's good, Bug. We'll be right there." And they stood for another moment before they went back out into the yard where Ava was swinging the rope with both hands and demanding witnesses. The board meeting was the following Tuesday. Victoria had been preparing for it for 2 weeks. A full presentation to the Sinclair Group's board on the current state of the Meridian litigation, the shareholder situation, and the financial structure going forward. It was the first board meeting she had attended since the insolvency revelation, and she had prepared it with the same rigor she brought to everything, which was to say, she had prepared it as if it were the most important meeting she had ever walked into, because in a certain respect it was. Harold was in the room when she arrived. He looked older still. She marked it every time she saw him, the particular process of watching a person you had always experienced as invulnerable become, through years of pressure, simply human. He was standing near the window, which was becoming his position. He looked at her when she came in. He had always been a difficult man to read, even for her, but she had known him for 30 years, and she could tell when he was working something out. "You look different," he said. "I look the same." "No." He considered her. "You look like something has settled." She sat down at the table and opened her presentation materials and did not respond to that, because there was no response that was both accurate and appropriate to the room. The meeting ran 2 hours and 30 minutes. She walked the board through the litigation status, the shareholder positions, the capital situation, the restructuring path that was now, thanks to the debt arrangement and the stabilized equity, actually viable. Patricia was there for the legal section. Gerald presented the financial analysis. Victoria handled everything else herself, from the opening to the close, and she did it with the particular authority of someone who had not only managed the crisis, but understood every layer of it from the inside. At the end, one of the board members, a man named Carver, who had been on the group's board for 12 years, and who had never, in Victoria's experience, expressed anything resembling warmth, said, "I understand the recovery plan. What I don't fully understand is what happened to Hale. His litigation strategy fell apart unusually fast." "He made errors," Victoria said. "The date discrepancy. Among other things, he moved too quickly. The debt arrangement changed his timeline, and he responded by compressing his own preparation." She paused. "People who are used to winning make that mistake. They know what the play looks like when they run it well, and they assume speed is a substitute for preparation." Carver looked at her for a moment. "And the debt arrangement itself, Brooks?" "The arrangement stands. We know relatively little about him." "I know him," Victoria said. She said it simply, without the weight she might have put on it in another context. "The arrangement is sound, the terms are favorable to the group, and the person behind it is someone who has demonstrated, over the time I've had to observe him, that his interest in this company's stability is genuine." Carver seemed to want to push further, and then seemed to decide against it, perhaps because of something in her expression. "All right," he said. The meeting ended. Harold caught up with her in the hallway. Carver wanted to know more about Brooks, he said. I know. What you said in there? He paused. That you know him. I do know him. Harold was quiet for a moment. And the situation, the house, the arrangement. He was choosing his words with an unusual care. It's more than I expected, she said. She looked at her father and let herself say the true thing without softening it or complicating it. It is significantly more than I expected. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something in his face do what she had not seen it do in years. Something that was simply relief, without the armoring of strategy around it. He looked like a man who had sent his daughter somewhere difficult and was seeing that she had come back from it carrying something rather than empty. He didn't say much. Good, was what he said. She drove back to Clairton in the late afternoon, in the gold quality of autumn light that sat in the trees along the residential streets, like something entirely deliberate, and she sat with the engine off for a moment in the driveway, not like she had that first day, not with the terrible stillness of someone who had to convince themselves to go in, just sitting, just the afternoon. Then she went inside, and the house smelled like something on the stove, and Ava was at the kitchen table with a book, but not really reading it because she looked up the moment the door opened, and from the stove Ethan said without turning around, "How'd it go?" "Well," she said. She set her bag by the door. "It went well." "Good." He still hadn't turned around. "Dad's making pasta," Ava said, with the information delivery of someone who considered this relevant to Victoria's well-being. "The kind with the tomatoes." "I saw." She sat down at the table. "How was your day?" Ava began telling her with full narrative commitment, and Ethan cooked, and the kitchen filled with the smell of garlic and tomatoes and the particular warm noise of a household in its evening rhythm. And Victoria sat at the table she had been sitting at for 6 weeks and felt the ground under the arrangement and found it real, found it more than real, found it the most solid thing she had stood on in years. Outside, the maple tree moved against the bedroom window. The rope in the oak tree hung still. Down the block, Roberta's house sat in its usual position of watchful calm, the light in the kitchen window already on. She had traded her life for a stranger's house. She understood now, sitting at this table, that she had gotten considerably the better end of that exchange, and that the stranger was no longer a stranger, and that the house had become, without her quite tracking the moment it happened, the place she came back to. Not the arrangement, not the contract, not the 3-month trial period she had proposed in a coffee shop that felt like a different era. Home. The word arrived without ceremony, without announcement, without asking permission. She let it stay. November came in cold and without apology. The maple tree outside the bedroom window lost most of its leaves in the first week, which Ava treated as a personal event worth tracking. She had been checking the tree every morning and reporting the count to whoever was in the kitchen. And the morning it went from mostly leafed to mostly bare. She stood at the window for a long time before coming downstairs with a look on her face that was not quite sad but was something in the neighborhood of thoughtful, which on a 6-year-old was an expression that required attention. "It lost almost all of them," she said. "It'll grow new ones in spring," Ethan said from the stove. "I know that," Ava said, with the patience of someone who had heard the practical reassurance but was processing something else. She sat down at the table and looked at her cereal. "I just liked how it looked before." Victoria looked at her across the table. "You can like how it looked before and still be okay with how it looks now," she said. "They're not the same tree, but they're both the same tree." Ava considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that required seriousness. "That's kind of confusing," she said finally. "Most true things are," Victoria said. Ethan turned from the stove briefly, and they exchanged a look over Ava's head. One of those looks that had developed between them over the weeks, the kind that required no annotation. It was, Victoria reflected, a small and completely ordinary morning. It was also, by any measure that actually mattered, one of the better mornings she had experienced in recent memory. That was the thing about the past several weeks she had been quietly sitting with, the way ordinary and meaningful had gradually become the same category rather than separate ones. She had spent most of her adult life treating ordinary things as obstacles between herself and what mattered, as noise to be managed on the way to the signal. She was finding out, slowly and somewhat against her original inclinations, that she had the signal theory entirely backwards. The final resolution of the Meridian litigation came on a Thursday, which was unremarkable, which was probably appropriate. Patricia called at 11 in the morning. Victoria was in her room working through a refinancing proposal that Gerald had sent over. The group's path to full stability, a structured plan that would take 18 months to complete but was now genuinely viable rather than theoretically viable when the call came. The court dismissed the primary claims, Patricia said without preamble. She had adopted Victoria's style over 8 months of working together, the habit of leading with the fact and explaining around it afterward. The date discrepancy on the disclosure claim was fatal to their fraud argument. The judge found no basis for the breach of fiduciary allegation given the documentation we provided. Meridian has 30 days to file an amended complaint, but they'd be building on the same inadequate foundation. They won't refile. I don't think so either. The press coverage of the dismissal is going to do more damage to their credibility than the litigation itself. 2 outlets already have the story. Victoria sat at her desk. Outside the window, the bare maple tree stood in the November light, branches clean and patient. And Hale? His institutional contacts are done. The shareholder who was most actively engaged with Corvin has formally notified them of no further interest. Patricia paused, and in the pause, Victoria could hear something that was not quite a professional clearing of throat, but served the same function. Victoria, this is over. You won. It was the first time Patricia had called her by her first name rather than her last. Victoria noted it without making anything of it. The company won, she said. Make sure Gerald knows before it's public. Already done. He cried a little, I think. He'll deny it. She hung up and sat at her desk for a while, not reviewing the refinancing proposal, just sitting with the particular quality of a thing being finished. The Sinclair Group would survive. The work that her father had built over 40 years, the thing she had given up her own path to come back and protect, would continue. The people who worked in that building, the Geralds and the Patricias, and the dozens of people below them whose names she didn't always know, but whose livelihoods had been genuinely at risk, would be okay. She had expected to feel more. She had expected the clean, high satisfaction of a major professional victory, the feeling she had known after previous wins that lasted for days. What she felt instead was quieter, more like settling than elation. Like a tension she'd been carrying had released, and underneath it was not a rush but a stillness. She went downstairs. Ethan was not home. He was at the garage, a Wednesday transmission job that had carried over. Ava was at school. The house was empty, and it was 11 in the morning, and she stood in the kitchen in the November light and looked at the small, ordinary room that had become the center of her life. And she thought about the person she had been 8 months ago in the back of a car with the Cortado and acquisition reports, and the thought did not make her sad. It made her feel the distance she had traveled, which was not the same as sad at all. She called her father. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "Patricia told you," she said. "Gerald told me." "Yes." His voice had the sound of something unspooling from a long, tight coil. "It's done." "It's done." A pause, longer than their usual pauses, which tended to be efficient. "Victoria." He stopped, started again. "I know what this cost you, the past 8 months." "It didn't cost me as much as you think," she said. "And some of what it cost me, I needed to pay." He was quiet for a moment. "You sound different." "You said that at the board meeting." "I said you look different. Now you sound different." Another pause. "Is it?" He seemed to be deciding how to ask what he wanted to ask. For a man who had spent his life asking hard things directly, the indirection told her something. "The arrangement. The house? Is it?" "Yes," she said, before he could finish. "Whatever you're asking, yes." She heard him breathe. "Good," he said. Same word as after the board meeting, but fuller this time, the way a word could carry more when the person saying it had stopped protecting themselves from meaning it. She told Ethan that night, after Ava was in bed. They were on the back porch, which was cold enough now to require jackets, and they sat in the 2 uneven chairs with mugs of something warm, and the bare oak tree making its winter silhouette against the streetlight glow beyond the fence. She had been carrying the news all day, had carried it through Ava's after-school arrival, and the report on what Priya had said at lunch, and the dinner that Ethan made, and the small rituals of the evening. And she had been content to carry it, which was itself notable. She was not a person who sat on information. She had sat on this because it felt right to tell him here, in this place, in this version of the evening that had become the one she returned to. The lawsuit was dismissed, she said. He turned toward her. Fully? Primary claims gone. They won't refile. He was quiet for a moment. The cold settled around them and the oak tree moved slightly, and somewhere down the block, a dog was making a late-night complaint about something. And Hale? Finished. His shareholder strategy is dead. The press coverage of the dismissal will follow him for years. She held her mug in both hands. The company is going to be okay. The refinancing plan Gerald has will take 18 months, but it's a real path, not a managed decline. Ethan nodded slowly. He was looking at the yard, but not in the distracted way, in the way he looked at things when he was actually thinking about them. How do you feel? It was such a direct question, asked with such genuine interest and no performance of concern, that she had to take a moment with it. Quiet, she said finally. I feel quiet, which is not what I expected. What did you expect? Something larger, something that matched the size of what it was. She looked at the yard too. I've won things before. Cases, negotiations, deals. It usually has a sound to it. This just feels like... She paused, looking for the right word. Like the last piece of something settling. Because it's not just a win, he said. It's the end of what started all of this, which means something else starts now. She looked at him. He was still looking at the yard, but she could see his profile in the dim light, and she knew him well enough now to read the quality of his stillness. Not distant, but present in the way he was when something mattered. Something else, she said. Yeah. He turned to look at her. What do you want that to look like? The question landed with a precision that made her understand he had been waiting, with the patience she had come to know was fundamental to who he was, for the crisis to resolve before asking it. He had not asked it when Meridian was still in play, had not asked it when she was running between this house and the group's offices. He had let it wait because he understood the difference between what people said under pressure and what they said when the pressure was actually off. She appreciated that. She appreciated it more than she could have explained to anyone who hadn't known her as long as she'd known herself. I don't want to go back to the 31st floor, she said. It was the truest answer, and she said it simply. I thought I might. When this was over, I thought I would feel the pull of it. I don't. The Sinclair Group, I'll stay involved. The refinancing plan needs managing, and the board needs someone who actually understands what happened this year. But I can do that from here. She looked at him steadily. If here is still... Yes, he said, with the same directness with which he'd asked the question. Here is still. The dog down the block had stopped its complaint. The yard was still. Somewhere in the house above them, through the back wall, was a room where a 6-year-old was asleep with her stuffed bear and her finished space shuttle on the dresser, and her drawing of Roberta's cat on the wall, sleeping with the complete and unguarded unconsciousness of a child who knew the house was full and the night was safe. Ethan reached over and took her hand. Not the brief, careful touch from the kitchen table weeks ago. This was the whole hand, held, settled. She did not move away from it. She sat in the uneven chair in the November cold with her mug of something warm and her hand in his, and she looked at the oak tree, and she let herself be where she was. There were things that didn't resolve cleanly, because real things didn't. Her relationship with her father remained complicated. Harold Sinclair was not a man who became simpler at 70, and the habits of decades, the distance, the communication through intermediaries, the emotional labor he had consistently declined to perform, did not dissolve because his company had survived a crisis. She had a conversation with him in December, in his study, in which she told him, as clearly as she could, what it had cost her to grow up in the shadow of a business rather than a parent, and he sat behind his desk and listened to it, and he did not defend himself, and at the end he said, I don't know how to undo what I did, but I'd like to know how to not do it anymore. It was not an apology. It was not sufficient. It was, for Harold Sinclair, the closest thing to raw honesty she had ever heard from him, and she was experienced enough with imperfect people to understand that you worked with what was real, not what was adequate. They were working with what was real. It was slow, and it was not graceful, and some days it felt like very little, and some days it felt like more than she'd expected to get. Ethan's relationship with his brother and the Caulfield firm was its own ongoing texture. His brother, a man named Garrett, who she met in January at a dinner that was stilted in the particular way of family occasions carrying years of unresolved weight, had opinions about Ethan's choices that he managed to make clear without stating directly, which was the Caulfield family's apparent mode. Ethan received these opinions with the equanimity of a man who had made peace with his choices and no longer needed anyone else to make peace with them. She watched him at that dinner and saw, with the clarity that only came from knowing someone well, that the equanimity was real, not performed, not defended, just simply his. Afterward, in the car, she said, "Your brother doesn't approve of the garage. He never has. He doesn't approve of me either. He'll get there, or he won't." He glanced at her. "Are you bothered by it?" She considered honestly. "I'm used to rooms where people are measuring me. At least he's direct about the measuring." Ethan almost smiled. "You two might actually get along eventually." "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," she said. And he did smile then, and she looked out the window at the winter streets and felt the warmth of him beside her in the car, and let herself have the warmth without making it complicated. The question of Marcus, Ethan's attorney, the voice from the phone call that had started everything unraveling, resolved itself in a way she hadn't anticipated. Marcus was a small, precisely dressed man who appeared in their lives in February to review the annual trust documentation, which was apparently a standard process. He arrived at the house for what she'd understood was a brief meeting and ended up staying for dinner because Ava, who had been told simply that Marcus was someone who helped her dad with paperwork, decided immediately that he was interesting and began asking him questions about what paperwork was like, which Marcus answered with surprising patience for a man who appeared to conduct his professional life at a pace that had no room in it for 6-year-olds. Victoria watched him over dinner and understood several things about Ethan through the lens of his long relationship with this man. Marcus had been Ethan's attorney since before Claire died. He had watched Ethan lose his wife and raise his daughter and run his garage and sit on money he didn't use and rebuild something quiet and real from the ruins of a life that could have gone several different ways. His protectiveness of Ethan was earned, not assumed. His skepticism of Victoria, which had been present at the start, had been earned too. After dinner, while Ethan was putting Ava to bed and Marcus was collecting his files in the kitchen, he said to her without looking up, "You stayed." "Yes," she said. "I didn't think you would." "I know." He looked at her then. He had eyes that assessed without warmth and delivered verdicts without appeal, the kind of eyes that belonged in courtrooms. "You're good for him," he said. It sounded like a judgment he had resisted for some time and had finally stopped resisting. She didn't say anything effusive. She said, "I know that too." He almost smiled. It was the most she was going to get from Marcus. She understood, and it was enough. Spring came back to the maple tree in the way spring always came back, without asking, without drama, just the slow return of green along the branches until one morning you noticed it was there and you couldn't say exactly when it had started. Ava noticed first, obviously. She came downstairs in March with the news that there were leaves happening, and the announcement had the same energy as the first morning of any event she'd been waiting for, which was to say it had a great deal of energy and required everyone in the kitchen to acknowledge it. "I told you," Ethan said. "I know you told me," Ava said, with the patience of someone who was conceding a point without letting the other person make too much of it. "That doesn't mean it's not exciting." Victoria was at this table with her coffee, and she looked at the window, and she could see it from where she sat, the faint, tentative green along the maple branches, the first suggestion of the leaves that would be fully there by April. She sat with her coffee, and she looked at it, and she thought about the first morning she had woken in this room and seen the maple tree without knowing it yet, without knowing any of it, just a stranger in a strange house looking at a tree through a window that looked out on someone else's life. She thought about the things she had believed, arriving here, that ordinary was a step down, that simplicity was something you settled for rather than something you chose, that the measure of a life was in the scale of it rather than the depth. She had been wrong about most of it. Not wrong in the easy way that allowed for a clean before and after story, but wrong in the complicated way that required you to acknowledge that the wrongness was not stupidity, but a kind of trained blindness, the result of years inside a particular world that measured everything in the currency it ran on, and gradually made it hard to perceive that other currencies existed. She had been measuring the wrong things. That was the simplest version of what she had learned here, in this house, in this life she had not chosen, and then had chosen, in the company of a man who had built something real from grief, and a girl who noticed when your eyebrows did the wrong thing and asked whether you were okay. The measure of a life, she now understood, was not in the boardrooms or the shareholder positions or the 42 floors of familiar territory. It was in the quality of your presence at the table. It was in whether you showed up to the gymnasium. It was in adequate soup made from 3 phone calls to a friend because someone was hungry and you were there. It was in the ground you stood on and whether it held. It held. That was the thing she kept coming back to, the thing that surprised her most. Not the love, which had arrived gradually, and then all at once with the specific inevitability of things that were always going to happen, but the groundedness, the sense of being located in something real. She had stood on polished floors and expensive shoes in rooms full of powerful people for most of her adult life, and she had never felt as located as she felt in this kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning with the maple tree going green outside the window. The conversation about what came next happened in April, without ceremony, on a Saturday morning while Ava was at Roberta's. They were in the kitchen. They were always in the kitchen, she had noted, for the important conversations, which she thought probably said something true about the house and about them. And Ethan was at the counter, and she was at the table, and they had been talking about the refinancing timeline, which was on schedule. And then the conversation had found its way to the edge of something larger, without either of them quite directing it there. "The 3 months you asked for," Ethan said, "at the coffee shop. 3 months and then reassess." "I remember." "It's been 8. He looked at her. "I know what I want. I've known for a while. But I want to know what you want." She had been thinking about this with the same care she brought to anything that mattered, which was to say she had been thinking about it thoroughly and honestly and without letting herself default to the easy answer in either direction. She had thought about what it would mean to fully choose this, not as a response to crisis, not as the arrangement finding its natural end, but as a genuine and considered choice made by a person who now knew exactly what she was choosing and what she was not. "I want to stay," she said. Not because the arrangement worked, not because the company is stable and it's convenient, because this... She stopped, looking for the right word, the true word rather than the adequate one. "Because this is where I want to be, with you, with Ava." She paused. She needs a mother. I know I can't replace what she lost. I'm not trying to, but I can be present. I want to be present. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. He had the line between his eyebrows, the one Ava monitored, and she watched at ease as she watched him. "The arrangement," he said. "The contract terms. I want to renegotiate." "Renegotiate how?" "Get rid of the contract." He said it simply. "I don't want a legal structure. I want a marriage." She held his gaze. "A real one. A real one." He came to the table and sat down across from her, which was not a posture he took when he was being casual. He sat across from her the way he had in the coffee shop 8 months ago, direct and fully there. "I know what I'm asking. I know what it means for the equity structure, for the trust, for all of it. I've talked to Marcus. The dissolution of the contract terms actually works in your family's favor. Marcus agrees. This isn't a financial play, it's just..." He stopped. "I love you. I've been trying to find the right moment to say it simply, and I don't think a better moment is coming. So, that's what it is." She looked at him across the table. The kitchen was ordinary and bright and smelled like coffee, and outside the window the backyard was doing its spring things, the oak tree fully leafed again, the rope hanging still, the tilted basketball hoop leaning at its permanent approximate angle. She thought about a purple horse that could fly but didn't because flying was scary, and a 6-year-old who had said maybe it just didn't feel safe yet. She thought about the ground and whether it was real, and the fact that she had said it was real and had been right. "I love you too," she said. "I have been terrible at saying it, and I am aware of that." Something in his face that was not quite a smile, more than a smile, less composed. "You're not terrible at it." "I'm working on it." "I know." He reached across the table and took her hand the way he had that first night on the porch, settled and sure. "We have time." They sat at the kitchen table in the April morning with their coffee and the ordinary light and the tree doing its quiet April things outside. And there was nothing elegant or extraordinary about the moment, nothing cinematic or performed. It was just two people at a table, holding on. Then Ava came home from Roberta's at noon with flour on her shirt, which meant the biscuits had happened again, and she came into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway and looked at the two of them at the table. And 6-year-olds did not miss things, which Ava had demonstrated consistently. "You're both smiling," she said. "Are we?" Victoria said. "Yes. The same kind." She appeared to think this required investigation. She came to the table and climbed into her chair. The chair in the middle, between them, that had become hers by the same organic process by which everything in this house had become what it was. She looked from one to the other. "Is something happening?" "Many things are always happening," Ethan said. "Dad." She used his name the way Victoria used Ethan's, but with weight, with the full force of a person who required a real answer. He looked at her. Then he looked at Victoria, and she gave him the slight nod that meant yes. "Victoria's going to stay," he said. "Not for a while, for a long time." Ava took this in. She was quiet for a moment, rare enough that it had a quality to it, the stillness of a child processing something that had weight. Then she looked at Victoria with her direct, unfiltered gaze. "You're going to be here," she said. "Yes," Victoria said. "I'm going to be here." "For real." "For real." Ava nodded slowly, and then she did something that undid Victoria completely, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that required any particular moment to mark it. She simply leaned over in her chair and pressed herself against Victoria's side, the way she pressed herself against Ethan when he came home late and she'd been waiting, the way she moved toward things she trusted, and she put her small hand on Victoria's arm and stayed there. Victoria looked at the maple tree through the kitchen window, fully leafed now, different from how it had looked in October and in January, and exactly the same tree. She put her arm around Ava and held on, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the world was doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous and full of all the things that could go wrong and occasionally didn't. Here's what Victoria Sinclair had learned, in a small house in Clairton, in a year she had not planned, that the life you negotiate for and the life you actually need are often in different zip codes, and the distance between them is where the important things happen. That a person can spend years measuring themselves by what they've built and what they've won, and what floor they occupy, and still have the most significant parts of themselves untouched, waiting in some quiet room they never bothered to enter. That children tell the truth without knowing they're being brave. That a man who loves his daughter carefully and shows up for dinner is not ordinary. Or maybe he is ordinary, and ordinary is simply a word that got diminished somewhere along the way by people who needed to feel they were above it. She had been one of those people. She wasn't anymore. That wasn't a clean transformation. She still checked her emails too early in the morning. She still went cold in conversations when she felt threatened, still had the instinct to lead with strategy rather than feeling. She was still her father's daughter in the ways that were useful and the ways that were not, and she was still learning to tell the difference. She was still, in 100 small ways, in the process of becoming the person she had found out she wanted to be. But she was in the process. That was the point. That was the whole point. Not arrival, not the clean resolution where the music swells and everything is healed, but the honest, ongoing work of a person who had looked at her own life clearly and chosen differently. The maple tree grew. Ava started second grade. The Sinclair Group's refinancing closed on schedule in the fall, ahead of projections, which made Gerald cry again, which he denied again. Roberta taught Ava to make biscuits that were finally, genuinely good, and declared this her proudest culinary achievement, which Ethan disputed on grounds that Roberta's red beans were the actual achievement, which became an ongoing disagreement that showed no signs of resolution. Harold Sinclair came to dinner in October, the first time he had ever been to the house, and he sat at the small kitchen table and ate pasta with tomatoes and talked to his granddaughter about whatever Ava decided they should talk about, which was dinosaurs. And he was stilted and uncomfortable and clearly trying, which was more than Victoria had sometimes believed he was capable of. And it was enough to start. Ethan finished his father's motorcycle in December. He took it out one Saturday morning in the cold, just around the neighborhood, just far enough to know it ran right. When he came back, Ava was on the porch waiting, and he lifted her up and let her sit on it in the driveway while it was still warm, and she held the handlebars with enormous seriousness. Victoria stood on the porch and watched them. She thought about what she had traded: the 31st floor, the cortado in the car, the person who stood at windows and looked down at things. She thought about what she had found. She thought about the purple horse that could fly but was afraid, and whether it had finally decided the sky was safe. She thought it probably had. The motorcycle stood in the driveway and Ava held the handlebars, and Ethan stood beside his daughter with his hand on her back, steady and sure. And the December light came down even and clean on the pale blue house, with the fading paint and the tilted basketball hoop and the oak tree and the rope. And Victoria Sinclair stood on the porch of the life she had chosen, and she was exactly where she was. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.